On that Father's Day, I prepared a small dinner in my penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. I had invited my son, his wife, her family, and a few old business contacts who had once promised to help his investment fund grow. 8 seats were set, the wine was open, and the roasted lamb slowly went cold under the candlelight. But by 6:17, no one had arrived. Then my phone lit up. Dad, stop calling my business partners. You're embarrassing me. I stood frozen in the silent room. He thought I was only trying to control his life. But that night, when I opened my late wife's old diary, I uncovered a truth that made everything begin to collapse. This story begins with an FBI question and ends somewhere I never expected. Before we start, leave a comment. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and telling the truth? Yes or no? Your answer might help someone feel less alone. Quick note, some details are adapted for storytelling. What matters is the lesson beneath it all. I stood at the table for 8, that no one came to watching my phone screen dim after reading my son's message for the third time. The roasted lamb had been perfect at 5:30. Now, at 6:17, fat congealed around the edges of the serving platter. 8 place settings. Wedgwood china, my late wife Elaine had insisted we keep for important occasions, surrounded the centerpiece of white lilies I'd driven 40 minutes to find. The Bordeaux I'd opened an hour ago sat untouched in the decanter, 40 years of marriage having taught me that wine needs to breathe. Everything needed to breathe, everything except this dinner. I was 60 years old. My name, Lester Ashford, had appeared on 23 major federal bridge and highway projects during my 40-year career as chief infrastructure engineer. I'd retired 3 years ago with enough savings to live comfortably in this penthouse on the 34th floor overlooking Lake Michigan. I'd spent the morning preparing this Father's Day dinner, not just for my son, but for the business contacts I'd invited to help expand his investment network. Men I'd worked with for decades. Men who respected the name Ashford enough to take my call. Men who never showed up. Stellan Ashford, 34 years old, CEO of the Alpha Nexus Investment Fund, and my only son had sent the text message at 5:47 p.m. Dad, stop contacting my business partners. Your presence is awkward. Paloma and her family think you're controlling me. We need space. No apology, no explanation, just that. I set the phone down next to the unused salad fork and looked out at Lake Michigan. The water had turned purple in the sunset, the color it always turned on June evenings when the light came in at that particular angle. Elaine used to say, I knew that angle exactly 47 degrees from horizontal, because I'd calculated it once while we were having coffee on the balcony. She'd laughed when I told her. Then she'd said something I'd never forgotten. You know everything in the world, Lester, except what's happening right in front of you. I thought she was teasing. Standing there at the empty table, I realized she'd been warning me. The candles burned lower. I should have blown them out, but I couldn't move. Somewhere in my mind, I was still calculating load, distribution stress points, failure thresholds. My son had just told me I was an obstacle to his life, and my first thought was to treat it like a structural problem. Identify the weakness, reinforce the beam, recalculate the load. I spent 40 years calculating load-bearing capacity, how much weight steel and concrete could hold before failure. I never thought to calculate the same thing for a relationship. The lamb went cold. The wine went flat. At 7:30, I scraped the entire meal into the garbage disposal and ran it until the grinding stopped. Then I stood at the sink, staring at my reflection in the window. Glass gray hair, deep lines around my eyes, shoulders that still held themselves straight from decades of inspecting construction sites. I looked competent, solid, like something that could bear weight. I looked like my father. The thought made my hands go still on the faucet. My father had died when I was 42, and I'd stood at his funeral thinking I'd done everything differently. I'd been present. I'd been supportive. I'd built a career worth respecting, and then offered my son every advantage I'd never had. He'd gone to Yale for his MBA. I'd paid cash. He'd started Alpha Nexus at 30, and I'd made introductions to investors who trusted my judgment. I'd built him a bridge to success. All he had to do was cross it. Instead, he'd sent me a text message telling me not to call his business partners anymore. At 11 p.m., I gave up trying to sleep. I sat in the leather armchair by the bedroom window, looking out at the city lights, and my eyes kept drifting to the oak wardrobe against the far wall. Elaine's diary was in the bottom drawer. I'd never opened it, not once in the 3 years since she'd died from pancreatic cancer. after fighting it for 8 months. It wasn't that I'd been forbidden, she'd never said, "Don't read it." But it had felt like a violation to look at something she'd written when she thought she was alone with her thoughts. Elaine Ashford and I had been married for 40 years before she died. I'd respected her privacy in life. I'd respected it in death. But tonight, sitting in the dark with my son's words still glowing behind my eyes, I needed to understand where I'd gone wrong. Let me tell you something about the space between what a man builds in his career and what he builds in his home. The first one gets inspected. The second one collapses in silence. I crossed the room and opened the wardrobe, past the pressed shirts, past the box of technical files I'd kept from my final projects. At the bottom of the drawer, wrapped in the gray wool scarf she'd worn every winter, was the navy blue diary, leather-bound, small enough to fit in a coat pocket. The spine cracked slightly when I lifted it, and I caught the faint smell of her perfume, something with jasmine and amber, that I'd bought her every Christmas for 20 years. I told myself it was respect that had kept me from opening it, but standing there holding it in both hands, I realized it was fear. Fear of what she might have written about me, about us, about the 40 years we'd spent building something I'd thought was solid. I carried it to the armchair and sat down. The first page was dated March 14th, 2003, written in red ink from the fountain pen she'd used for 20 years. The date hit me like a fist to the sternum. March 14th, 2003. The day I'd signed the Harrington Crossing contract, the biggest bridge project of my career, the one that had put my name on the shortlist for every major infrastructure bid in the Midwest. The day everything changed, my hand trembled slightly as I began to read. Not from the cold, not from exhaustion. She knew. She had known for a long time without telling me. The first entry was about the night I came home at 11 p.m. after signing the Harrington Crossing contract, too excited about steel specifications to notice she'd been crying. March 14th, 2003. Elaine had written in that careful cursive she'd learned in elementary school. Lester came home 3 hours late. He wanted to tell me about the tensile strength calculations for the main suspension cables. I'd been crying for 2 hours because Stellan asked me where Daddy was at his school concert tonight. Lester didn't notice my eyes were red. He was too busy explaining how the bridge would hold 40,000 tons. I read that paragraph 3 times. I remembered that night. I remembered being elated. The Harrington contract was worth $42 million, the kind of project that made careers. I remembered telling Elaine about the cable specifications over a glass of scotch at the kitchen counter. I didn't remember Stellan's concert. I didn't remember that I'd promised to go. I turned the page. The entries weren't daily. Sometimes weeks would pass between them, but the pattern was there, clear as blueprints, once you knew what you were looking at. June 2005. I'd missed Stellan's 8th birthday party to inspect a construction site in Milwaukee. Elaine wrote that he'd asked if I was coming home, and she'd told him I was building something important. He'd said more important than me. September 2007. I'd attended a bridge opening ceremony in Indianapolis the same day as Stellan's high school orientation. Elaine went alone. Stellan had asked her why I cared more about bridges than people. November 2011. Thanksgiving dinner. I'd spent the meal calculating load ratios on napkins while Stellan talked about starting his own business someday. Elaine wrote, he stopped talking mid-sentence when he realized his father wasn't listening. I watched my son learn that his words don't matter as much as his father's equations. The entries weren't angry. That was what made them unbearable. They were just sad observations of a man who measured everything except what mattered. I kept reading. March 2018. Stellan was 32, just finishing his MBA. He'd asked me to co-sign a business loan, something about seed funding for an investment fund he wanted to start. I'd signed the papers without reading them right there at the kitchen table while Elaine watched. Robert signed today without reading the loan terms she'd written. Stellan asked if he was sure. Robert said my son wouldn't deceive me. I wanted to believe that too, but I've watched 30 years of Stellan learning that shortcuts work, that explanations don't matter, that his father will sign anything without looking as long as it sounds like success. My hands were shaking now. Let me tell you what it feels like to read your dead wife's diary and realize she spent 15 years watching you choose blueprints over your child's birthday parties and never once blamed you out loud. It feels like standing in a building you designed, watching the foundation crack, and understanding that the flaw was in the original calculations, that you can't fix it now, That it's been wrong the whole time and you just never bothered to check. I turned to April 2020. The handwriting changed here, less steady. The lines wavered. Stage 2 pancreatic cancer, the entry began. Dr. Morrison says 2 to 3 years with treatment. Lester doesn't know yet. I asked the doctor to let me tell him myself. I'm scared. I remembered that day. She'd told me that night very calmly, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded. I'd felt the world tilt sideways. I'd promised her anything, any treatment, any specialist, any cost. What I didn't know was what happened 3 days later. Stellan visited me at the hospital today, she wrote. Alone. He brought me flowers and a proposal. He's starting an investment fund, high return safe, managed by professionals he's been working with. He said I could invest my savings and triple them in 18 months. More than enough to cover any treatment costs without burdening Lester's insurance or his pride. The next line was underlined. I transferred $7.2 million today. 35 years of my own money from my own career. Stellan says it will be the nucleus of his Alpha Nexus fund. He says I'll be his first major investor. I'm so proud of him. I stopped reading, stared at the page. $7.2 million. Her entire life savings. I forced myself to keep going. December 2020, 6 months later. The cancer is worse than expected. Dr. Morrison recommended an experimental treatment at Johns Hopkins $1.8 million, not covered by insurance. I checked the Alpha Nexus account today. It shows $340,000 remaining. I called Stellan. He said temporary market adjustment, money coming back soon. Don't worry, Mom. I know the truth. I know my son stole my life to start his fund. The words were there in her handwriting perfectly clear. 14 months. That's how much of her life my son's lie cost. 14 months she could have had treatment. 14 months I could have said goodbye properly. She died in March 2021. Stage 2 pancreatic cancer with treatment should have given her at least another year, maybe 2. Instead, she declined the experimental treatment. Told me the doctor said it wouldn't help. Told me she wanted to spend her remaining time comfortable at home. She'd lied to me to protect him. I reached the last page. The handwriting was barely legible now. She must have written it in her final days when the pain medication made it hard to hold a pen. Lester, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I kept this from you. I'm sorry I let Stellan take my treatment fund. I'm sorry I died protecting him instead of fighting for more time with you. But please don't blame him. He never had to face consequences of his own actions. We never taught him. I never taught him. You were too busy building bridges, and I was too busy protecting him from your absence. Save him by teaching him what I couldn't. The truth will hurt, but lies will destroy him. Don't let our son become someone neither of us would recognize. I love you. I always did. Even when you were calculating bridge loads at our dinner table. I closed the diary at 2 a.m. and placed it on the table beside Elaine's photograph. Then I stood, walked to the kitchen, and made a fresh pot of coffee, not to calm my anger, but to sharpen it. I sat down at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and a pen and began to write. Not a letter. A plan. A plan. At 6:03 a.m. After 4 hours of planning alone in the dark penthouse, I picked up my phone and called the one man I trusted to tell me the truth about numbers. Vernon Greer answered on the second ring. He'd been my closest friend for 30 years since we'd worked together on the Interstate 94 expansion project in 1994. We'd reviewed each other's calculations before signing anything significant. If there was a structural flaw in my son's business, Vernon would find it. Vernon, I said without preamble, I need you to check the entire legal and financial structure of my son's investment fund. Everything. 4 seconds of silence on the line. Then I started checking 3 weeks ago. I'm on my way to you. The call ended. I stood holding the phone, watching the golden dawn light spread across Lake Michigan through the kitchen windows. 3 weeks ago. Vernon had been investigating my son's fund for 3 weeks without telling me, which meant he'd seen something alarming enough to act on his own? Something he'd been hoping to prove wrong before bringing it to me. I poured a third cup of coffee and waited. Vernon Greer arrived at 8 a.m. He was 63, with silver hair, cut military short, and the kind of precise movements that come from a lifetime of checking other people's math. He carried a leather briefcase that looked heavier than it should have been, and his face had the expression of a man who'd spent 3 weeks hoping he was wrong about everything he'd found. He didn't say hello. He walked straight to my kitchen table, set down the briefcase, and started pulling out documents. 147 pages. double-sided, color-coded tabs. He spread them across the entire surface of the table. Investor statements, legal filings, bank transfers, corporate structure diagrams. I recognized the way he'd organized them. It was the same system we'd used on bridge projects when we needed to trace every load path through a complex structure. Alpha Nexus is a classic three-tier Ponzi scheme, Vernon said, not looking at me. New investor money pays returns to earlier investors. No actual profitable investments. $47 million total in the fund right now. I set my coffee cup down very carefully. In every legal document, Vernon continued, pointing to a stack of papers on the left side of the table, has your name listed as chairman of the founding board. He pulled out a magnified printout of a signature. My signature. On Alpha Nexus founding documents, investor prospectuses, regulatory filings. The signatures are digitally forged, Vernon said, assembled from scanned copies of your old consulting contracts. Stellan pulled pieces of your signature from different documents and stitched them together digitally. Professional work. Would pass most authenticity checks. I looked at my name on those documents. Chairman of the founding board. A position I'd never held. A fund I'd never managed. If this fund collapses, Vernon said quietly, you're the first person the SEC calls. Your name is on everything, your reputation backing every promise. The investors think there is putting money into a fund run by the legendary infrastructure engineer Lester Ashford. For 30 years, Vernon and I reviewed each other's calculations before signing anything significant. Now I understood he'd been reviewing my son's calculations while I wasn't looking. How long have you known? I asked. 3 weeks. I saw Stellan's name in a financial newsletter, New Fund Manager to Watch. It mentioned you as the founding chairman. I knew you'd never mentioned being involved in his fund, so I started checking. Took me 4 days to confirm the Ponzi structure, 2 weeks to trace all the forged signatures. Why didn't you tell me immediately? Vernon finally looked at me directly. Because I hoped I was wrong. Because I've known Stellan since he was 8 years old. Because I didn't want to be the person who had to tell you your son was a criminal. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a separate envelope, placed it on the table between us. But there's something else, he said, something worse. I opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of founding shareholder papers for Alpha Nexus, dated March 2018, the same month Elaine had written about in her diary, the business loan I'd co-signed without reading. Except it wasn't a loan. It was a $3 million capital investment. My signature on the bottom line. Real ink, real paper, not a forgery. I gave him $3 million, I said, slowly remembering, to start his business. He said he needed seed capital for his investment fund. I was proud of him. Thought he was finally building something legitimate. $47 million, 47 families, each one thinking they were investing with a legitimate fund, backed by a legendary engineer's reputation. Look at the corporate structure, Vernon said, pointing to a diagram. You're not listed as a silent investor. You're the founding chairman with ongoing fiduciary responsibility. If the SEC investigates, your name is at the top of every document. You had initial capital investment. You had signature authority, or so it appears. You're the shield. I stared at the diagram. Stellan's name was buried 3 layers deep in subsidiary structures. My name was front and center. He didn't forge this signature, I said, holding up the 2018 investment papers. No, Vernon agreed. That one's real. He got you to actually sign your investment in his fund 6 years ago. Then he built the Ponzi structure around it, forged your signature on everything else, and positioned you as the legal face of the operation. If it collapses, you're the one who goes to prison, while he claims he was just following the chairman's directives. I set the papers down on the table. He kept me in the structure, I said. Not as a partner, as a shield in front of him. Vernon nodded. The most valuable thing you ever gave him wasn't the money. It was your name, your reputation. 40 years of building bridges that never fell. That's what he's been selling to investors. And when this collapses, and it will collapse, they always do, you're the one standing at the front of the room when the FBI comes through the door. I held the envelope containing my real signature from 2018. The money I'd given Stellan to start his business, proud that my son was finally building something of his own. The most expensive thing I'd ever built wasn't a bridge. It was the perfect legal trap I'd walked into 6 years ago. Signing papers without reading them, trusting my son because I thought that's what fathers were supposed to do. The intercom buzzed at 10 a.m. while Vernon and I were still reviewing the documents spread across my kitchen table, building security. asking if I'd see a woman who'd arrived in an ICU uniform looking for the address listed on Alpha Nexus's registered agent papers. I looked at Vernon. He looked at the $47 million in forged paperwork between us. Send her up, I said into the intercom. Ramona Garrison was 45 years old, an ICU nurse, still wearing her wrinkled night shift uniform with a name tag barely visible under her jacket. She was carrying only her phone and a folder of documents she'd been clutching so tightly the edges had started to crease. She stood in my doorway looking exhausted in the way that comes from working 12-hour shifts and not sleeping well when you get home. The registered agent address on the fund documents, she said without introduction. It's this building. I didn't know where else to look. The downtown office is empty. Nobody answers the phone. The email bounces back. I stepped aside to let her in. She walked into the penthouse living area and stopped when she saw Vernon's documents spread across the kitchen table. The color drained from her face. What? That's the Alpha Nexus logo, she said, pointing at one of the investor prospectuses. You're investigating it too. She looked from the documents to me, to Vernon, and back again. Does that mean... Her voice caught. Is my money... Sit down, I said, pulling out a chair at the table. I need you to tell me everything from the beginning, every detail. Don't leave anything out. She sat, opened her folder with shaking hands. $280,000, she said. 22 years of savings. My husband died 6 years ago. Heart attack at 43. Left me with a mortgage and 2 kids in college. I've been working double shifts, saving everything I could. I went to an investment seminar in April. Someone at the hospital gave me a flyer. Said it was for healthcare professionals looking to build retirement funds. She pulled out a glossy brochure. Alpha Nexus Capital Management. Conservative growth strategy. Managed by award-winning team. Chairman Lester Ashford. PE 40 years infrastructure engineering. My name, my credentials, my photograph from a 2019 industry conference. Your son gave the presentation, Ramona continued. He talked about stable returns, infrastructure investment strategies, how the fund was backed by your reputation and decades of successful projects. He showed photos of bridges you'd built, said investing with Alpha Nexus was like investing in structures that never fail. Let me tell you what it's like to meet the face behind the numbers. $280,000 isn't an abstract figure when it's standing in your living room wearing a nurse's uniform she hasn't had time to change out of. The account statements looked good for the first 2 months, she said. 8% returns. Then last month, nothing. No statements, no responses to emails. I called the downtown office, just got a voicemail. Finally went there in person yesterday. The office is completely empty, not even furniture, like they were never there. She was crying now, quiet tears running down her face while she kept her voice steady. I have $11,000 left in my checking account. That was supposed to be next semester's tuition for my daughter. I don't know how I'm going to tell her she can't go back to school. Vernon had been silent throughout this. Now he reached across the table and placed one of his audit summaries in front of her. The fund is a Ponzi scheme, he said quietly. Your money was used to pay fake returns to earlier investors. There are 47 families like yours. We're working on finding out how much can be recovered. Ramona stared at the document. Then she looked up at me. But your name, she said. Your signature. You're the chairman. The brochure said, my signature was forged, I said. I didn't know about this fund. My son used my reputation without my knowledge or consent. She closed her eyes, sat very still. I have to get to work, she said finally. My shift starts at 3. Will you call me when you know more? I need to know if there's any chance. I wrote down her phone number, walked her to the door, watched her get into the elevator, still wearing that wrinkled uniform, still carrying the folder that contained her entire financial life. When I came back to the kitchen, Vernon was standing at the window, looking out at the lake. There are 46 more like her, he said. I know. How long have you suspected? I walked to my home office, unlocked the 3rd drawer of the filing cabinet, behind a row of technical drawings. Inside was a gray-covered file marked with colored tabs and careful pencil annotations. I brought it back to the kitchen table and set it down in front of Vernon. He opened it, scanned the first page, looked at the date. November 2023, he read aloud. 7 months ago. Stellan refused to show me the fund's quarterly financial report, I said. Said investor confidentiality prevented him from sharing details, even with family. That was the first time he'd ever refused to tell me something about his business. So I hired a private detective agency, corporate finance specialist. had them monitor Alpha Nexus activities. Vernon flipped through the pages. Bank records, investment tracking, corporate structure analysis, meeting surveillance logs. You've known, Vernon said. It wasn't a question. I suspected, I corrected. Now I know. How do you explain to your oldest friend that you've been investigating your own son for 7 months without saying a word, and that you understand exactly why he did the same thing to you? Vernon set the file down carefully. I started checking 3 weeks ago, he said. You never asked me why. Same reason I didn't tell you about this file, I said. Hope. The kind that makes you think maybe you're wrong. Maybe your son isn't a criminal. Maybe your friend will find an innocent explanation. There's another reason, Vernon said quietly. He looked at the gray file, then back at me. 3 weeks ago, your son called me. Not to chat, not to ask advice, to remind me of something I did 15 years ago, something involving him that I thought was buried. He wanted information about your financial activities, your investment portfolio, your liquid assets. Vernon's hands were steady on the file, but his voice wasn't. That's when I knew he wasn't just reckless. He was calculating. He was planning something. And he was using what I did in 2009 to make sure I'd cooperate. He met my eyes. I need to tell you what I did 15 years ago, he said. And I need to tell you what he's been using it for. Vernon told me everything Sunday night. By Monday morning at 9:47, I was sitting in a glass conference room on the 22nd floor of an investment bank overlooking the Chicago River, signing the withdrawal authorization that would collapse my son's empire. The bank relationship manager asked if I wanted coffee while we processed the $18.5 million transfer. No, I said. I'm fine. Celeste Farrell sat beside me. She was 55, a federal civil and criminal attorney who'd handled my estate documents for 18 years. She'd arrived at the bank carrying the 2018 founding agreement and a notary seal we'd need later. I'd reread that agreement Sunday night after Vernon left. Every clause, every paragraph, every piece of fine print I'd written 6 years ago when I gave Stellan $3 million to start his business. Most people don't read founding agreements carefully. They trust lawyers to handle the details. They focus on the big numbers. Investment amounts, ownership percentages, profit sharing. I'd been an engineer for 40 years. I read structural specifications the way most people read novels, carefully looking for the one sentence that would matter when everything else failed. Clause 17, subsection C. Any founding shareholder may withdraw all contributed collateral within 24 hours upon discovery of evidence suggesting fraudulent misrepresentation of fund activities, provided such withdrawal is accompanied by formal SEC notification. I'd written that clause myself. Stellan had signed it without legal review. The fraud detection clause you added in 2018, Celeste said, tapping the paper in front of us. It's ironclad. He signed this agreement without having a lawyer look at it. Once we execute, the bank triggers the automatic freeze within 8 hours. The bank manager returned with a folder of authorization forms. His name was printed on a desk placard, Michael Hendricks, Senior Relationship Manager. He'd been professionally pleasant when we arrived, but I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. $18.5 million leaving the bank meant questions from his supervisors. The withdrawal will complete by 1:18 p.m. he said, setting the papers in front of me. We're required to notify all authorized fund representatives immediately. Then they have 8 hours to replace the collateral, or the fund freezes automatically under the loan agreement terms. I signed the first form, then the second, then the third. A bridge collapses in a specific sequence. You calculate which beam to remove, and the rest follows structural inevitability. I just removed the beam. I built that clause 6 years ago, the same way I built bridges. Load calculations, failure points, exactly where the structure collapses when you remove the right beam. Thank you, I said to Michael Hendricks. We'll be available by phone if you need anything. Celeste and I left the building at 11:45. She asked if I was sure about this. Yes, I said. She drove me back to my penthouse. I went upstairs, made myself lunch, and sat down in my living room armchair with the novel I'd started 3 weeks ago. I was on page 247. The main character had just discovered his business partner had been embezzling for years. I set my phone face up on the table beside a glass of water. At 1:23 p.m., exactly 5 minutes after the transfer completed, my phone rang. Stellan. I watched it ring, watched his name on the screen, watched it go to voicemail. 5 minutes. It took him exactly 5 minutes from notification to panic. That told me everything I needed to know about how much time he had left. The phone rang again at 1:31 p.m. Stellan again. I turned the page of my book. 1:47 p.m. Paloma this time. Her name lit up the screen. I kept reading. 2:15 p.m. Stellan. 2:33 p.m. Paloma. 2:58 p.m. A number I had saved years ago. Margaret Holbrook, Paloma's mother. I'd met her at Stellan's wedding. She'd seemed pleasant then, proud of her daughter marrying into what she thought was a successful family. 3:22 p.m. Stellan. 3:45 p.m. Paloma. 4:18 p.m. Margaret Holbrook again. 4:52 p.m. An unknown number. It went to voicemail. I played it on speaker. Mr. Ashford, this is Todd Brennan, legal counsel for your son Stellan. I'm calling regarding urgent financial matters that require immediate family discussion. Please return this call at your earliest convenience. The voice was carefully professional, the kind of tone lawyers use when they've just realized their client's situation is worse than disclosed. I deleted the voicemail. 23 calls in 7 hours. Let me tell you what that number means. It's the sound of a man watching everything he built unravel in real time, reaching out to everyone he thought could save him, and realizing nobody can. 5:47 p.m. Stellan. 6:15 p.m. Paloma. 6:38 p.m. Margaret Holbrook. 7:03 p.m. Todd Brennan again. Another voicemail I deleted without listening. 7:22 p.m. Stellan. 7:45 p.m. Paloma. 7:58 p.m. I was reading page 284 when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The bank. Automated message. Collateral replacement deadline expired. Automatic fund freeze executed per loan agreement. Section 12D. I kept reading. 8:09 p.m. A text message. Not a call this time. Stellan had given up trying to talk to me. I read it 3 times. Dad, do you know what you just did? You're going to regret it. I swear to you, you're going to regret it. I thought about that for a minute. Thought about what Elaine had written in her diary. Thought about Ramona Garrison in her ICU uniform clutching a folder of worthless investment statements. Thought about 46 other families I hadn't met yet. I typed 4 words. Okay, see you. Sent it. Set the phone face down on the table. Went back to page 284. The character in the book had just walked into a dark room. He didn't know who was waiting for him in there. I thought neither does Stellan. Neither does Stellan. I slept 7 hours Monday night. Woke at 6 Tuesday morning, made coffee, and at 8:30 left for my morning walk along Lake Michigan. My doctor had ordered 45 minutes of walking daily for the past 3 years. I'd missed exactly 2 days. I was 20 minutes into the walk when my phone rang at 9 a.m. and Stellan's voice came through without greeting. We need to talk about what happens next, Dad. No panic, no desperation. The voice from yesterday's 23 unanswered calls had been frantic unraveling. This voice was cold, methodical, calculated. I kept walking. I'm listening, I said. You have 48 hours to deposit the collateral back into the account, Stellan said. Wednesday midnight. If the money isn't restored by then, my attorney files documentation with federal court Thursday morning. What documentation? Evidence proving you were the true mastermind of Alpha Nexus operations, that I was executing your instructions, that you directed every decision from fund structure to investor recruitment to financial disbursements. I stopped walking. Ahead of me, an elderly couple moved slowly along the path, the man's hand steadying his wife over an uneven section of concrete. They must have been in their 80s, moving carefully, together. You're bluffing, I said. November 9th, 2022. Stellan replied immediately. You came to my office, we discussed expansion strategy. I have notes from that meeting showing you gave specific instructions on investor recruitment targets, minimum investment thresholds, return projection parameters, all in your handwriting. November 9th, 2022. I'd been in Seattle that day. Industry conference. I had the hotel receipt. I was in Seattle, I said. Were you? My notes say otherwise. So does my building's security log showing your name on the visitor register. So do the emails you sent me that week with strategic directives. The fabrication was sophisticated, not panicked, not improvised. He'd been building this for years. How long have you been preparing this? I asked. 2 years, Stellan said. There was something like pride in his voice. I've had contingency documentation since 2022. Meeting notes, email trails, wire transfer instructions with your signature. My lawyer says it's prosecutable. Says any jury will believe the 60-year-old legendary engineer was controlling his 34-year-old son's investment fund. Todd Brennan, I said. That's who you mean by my lawyer. Todd's very good. He's reviewed everything. Thursday morning, if the money isn't back, he files. You become the target of the federal investigation instead of me. The elderly couple ahead had stopped. The woman was adjusting her shoe. The man stood patient, one hand on her shoulder, waiting. The elderly couple ahead of me. The man steadying his wife over broken pavement looked exactly like Elaine, and I would have looked if I'd built her 40 more years instead of building my son's escape route. Thursday, I said, 2 p.m. My office downtown. Bring Todd if you want. I hung up before he could respond. Walked the full 45 minutes my doctor had ordered. When I got back to the penthouse at 10:15, Vernon was in my office, surrounded by storage boxes labeled 1999 to 2005. Old project files I'd kept in case of litigation or audit review. He'd spread them across my desk, cross-referencing against the private detective report. He didn't look up when I came in. Harrington Crossing Bridge Project, he read aloud. Contract signing March 14th, 2003. I stopped in the doorway. March 14th, 2003. The first entry in Elaine's diary. The day she'd started documenting the distance I was building between myself and everyone I loved. I remember, I said. Vernon kept reading from the audit summary. Preliminary foundation inspection conducted March 11th, 2003. Auditing engineer rejected contractor's rebar placement specifications. Claimed corners were cut to meet deadline. Project committee overruled the rejection March 13th. Engineer subsequently terminated for unprofessional conduct March 18th. He looked up at me. Do you remember the engineer's name? I walked to the desk, looked at the typed report. Ernest Holbrook, P.E. Professional Engineer, licensed since 1984. The name meant nothing at first, just another engineer who'd been on another project 2 decades ago. Then Vernon slid a second document across the desk. Paloma's marriage certificate, filed with Cook County in May 2018. Paloma Ann Holbrook. I pulled out my phone, looked at her contact entry. Paloma Holbrook, perfect match. 21 years. That's how long it takes for a single moment of cowardice to circle back and stand in your living room wearing your daughter-in-law's face. I remember that meeting, I said slowly. The project committee. 5 of us voting on whether to overrule the auditing engineer's rejection. The contractor was the boss's golf partner. Big political connections. The committee wanted the project to move forward on schedule. How did you vote? Vernon asked. I voted with the committee, I said. I told myself it was one audit. One engineer I didn't know, that the contractor probably knew what he was doing, that the foundation would be fine. Was it fine? The bridge is still standing, I said. 21 years later, never had a structural issue. But Ernest Holbrook's career ended, Vernon said. Fired for unprofessional conduct, blacklisted in the industry for questioning a politically connected contractor. I sat down in my desk chair. Ernest Holbrook, I said. Paloma Holbrook? Vernon, my daughter-in-law's father, is the man whose career I helped destroy in 2003. Vernon closed the file slowly. You think it's coincidence, he asked, that she met your son, that they fell in love, that she married into your family? I thought about Stellan's sophisticated 2-year blackmail preparation, thought about fabricated meeting notes and forged security logs, thought about how long it takes to build that kind of revenge. No, I said, I don't think it's coincidence. Vernon looked at the name in the 2003 audit report, then at Paloma's contact on my phone. You think she knew? He asked quietly. You think she married him because of what you did to her father? I thought about Elaine's diary. The entry dated March 14th, 2003, the day I signed the Harrington contract, the day everything became about building things that could be measured. I think, I said slowly, that I've been standing on a foundation that was flawed from the beginning, and I'm only just now feeling it shift. After we'd both stared at Ernest Holbrook's name for a full minute, I turned to Vernon and asked the question he'd been avoiding for 3 days. What exactly did you do in 2009 that my son is using against you? Vernon closed the 2003 audit file, pushed it aside, sat down at my kitchen table. Stellan was 19, he said, fresh out of college, working at a small accounting firm in Evanston, his first real job. During an internal audit, he discovered a significant error in a client report. Vernon picked up one of the water glasses I'd set on the table earlier, didn't drink from it, just held it. A misclassification, he continued. $2.3 million listed under the wrong category. If it got reported formally, it would trigger a regulatory review. The firm would lose its biggest client, maybe fold entirely. And you were involved how? I was the external auditor reviewing the firm's work that quarter. Stellan approached me privately, explained the situation, asked for guidance, said he didn't want to destroy the firm over what was technically just a paperwork error. Vernon set the glass down carefully. I thought of you, he said. My best friend's son, 19 years old, smart kid trying to do the right thing in a complicated situation. So I made an internal notation instead of a formal report. Let the firm fix it quietly. No regulatory involvement, no investigation. You bent the rules, I said. I bent the rules, Vernon agreed. For your son, because I thought I was helping him start his career right, teaching him that sometimes flexibility matters more than rigid enforcement. He looked at me directly. 3 weeks ago, Stellan called me, not to chat, not to ask how I was doing, to remind me of that 2009 audit, said he needed information about your financial activities, your schedule, your business meetings, said if I didn't cooperate, he'd make sure the 2009 audit came back into the light, that my license would be reviewed, that at 63 years old, I'd be defending myself against ethics violations. What did you give him? Only your public schedule, Vernon said. Things anyone could find, your gym hours, your morning walks, the times you usually had dinner. Nothing sensitive, nothing private. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder, and I recorded every single call he made, every word, every threat, every attempt to coerce information about you using my 15-year-old mistake as leverage. Vernon and I had both made the same mistake 15 years apart. We thought we were building safety nets beneath people we loved, when really we were building scaffolding for them to climb higher before the inevitable fall. I thought I was protecting your son, Vernon said quietly. I was teaching him that rules bend for the right people, that connections matter more than integrity. That's the foundation he built his entire life on. I sat across from him at the kitchen table. Two men in their 60s who'd spent 40 years building things looking at the structure we'd accidentally created together. Thank you, I said, for telling me and for recording those calls. What are you going to do with them? I don't know yet, I said, but I will by tomorrow morning, Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. I sat in Celeste Farrell's office on the second floor of a red brick building on LaSalle Street. The window overlooked the Chicago River, same river I'd looked at from the bank conference room 2 days ago. Celeste had spread papers across her desk. The forged signature analysis, Vernon's audit documentation, the private detective reports from my 7-month investigation. Digital signature forensics can refute these forgeries, she said, tapping the Alpha Nexus founding documents. But the process takes 4 to 6 weeks. You don't have that time. Your son files his fabricated evidence tomorrow morning unless you restore the collateral by midnight tonight. So what's the alternative? Proactive FBI contact, Celeste said. Before he files, before Thursday morning, the first person to knock on the FBI's door is viewed as the cooperative witness. The second person is the suspect trying to cover his tracks. Simple as that. She pulled out another document. Illinois is a one-party consent state. Any recordings you make at tomorrow's meeting are legally admissible without his knowledge or permission, and I'm a certified notary public with federal credentials. Any document he signs in front of me has immediate legal weight, can't be disputed later as coerced or fraudulent. Let me tell you what it means to sit in a lawyer's office at 8 a.m. on a Wednesday and be asked if you're ready to destroy your only child's freedom. The question isn't rhetorical. The answer has consequences that last decades. There's something else, Celeste said. She pulled out the SEC preliminary filing she'd submitted Monday. This references a Marriott Hotel seminar in April 2024. Multiple investors attended. Do you know anything about it? Ramona mentioned a seminar, I said, where Stellan gave a presentation about the fund. We need to talk to her again, Celeste said. See what she remembers. Sometimes witnesses recall details later that didn't seem important at first. She set down the papers and looked at me directly. There's one thing you need to prepare yourself for. If you proactively contact the FBI with this evidence, Vernon's recordings, the forged signatures, the Ponzi structure documentation, your son is almost certainly going to prison. Not maybe, not possibly, almost certainly. Securities fraud with this level of sophistication and this much money involved federal sentencing guidelines are very clear. She paused. Are you ready for that? I looked out her window at the Chicago River, gray and slow-moving in the morning light. Same river I'd looked at from the bank conference room when I signed the withdrawal authorization that started this collapse. I've been ready since Saturday night, I said, when I closed Elaine's diary and understood what he'd done to her, what he stole from her. The question isn't whether I'm ready. The question is whether I have the patience to do it the right way, methodically, legally, so it holds weight when we're finished. Celeste nodded once. Then we need to make another call before Thursday, she said, picking up her phone. And you need to hear something that a widow recorded at a seminar in April. At 2 p.m. Wednesday, while I was reviewing Vernon's recordings of Stellan's blackmail calls, my phone rang with Ramona Garrison's number. The widow I'd thought I wouldn't hear from again until the legal proceedings began. Mr. Ashford, she said, I'm sorry to bother you again. I remembered something from Sunday I forgot to mention. I stepped out onto the penthouse balcony. The afternoon sun angled through the glass, cutting geometric patterns across the concrete. What is it? The seminar, she said, at the Marriott in April, where I invested the money. After the presentation ended, everyone left. People were heading to the parking garage, talking about returns and retirement plans. I realized I'd forgotten my handbag in the conference room. She paused. When I went back, the door was slightly open. Your son was alone on his phone. The voice, it wasn't the same man who'd just given that warm presentation about conservative growth strategies. This voice was cold, specific. He was discussing account numbers and transfer schedules with someone. What did you do? I felt something was deeply wrong, so I pulled out my phone and started recording through the door gap. 4 minutes and 37 seconds before he hung up and I had to walk away. I gripped the balcony railing. You have a recording of my son discussing fund operations. It's been sitting on my phone since April, Ramona said. I didn't know what to do with it. Didn't know if it meant anything or if I was just paranoid because I'd invested so much money. She hesitated. If I give this to you, will I be summoned to court as a witness? I could have lied. Could have said, probably not. Don't worry about it. Just send the file. But I'd spent too many years watching people bend truth for convenience. Maybe, I said. Probably. If this recording contains what I think it does, you'll likely have to testify under oath about when and how you recorded it. Long silence on the line. There are 46 other families who lost everything, I added quietly. Someone has to be brave enough to step forward first. Another silence. Then I'll email it to you tonight. Let me tell you what 4 minutes and 37 seconds means in a federal fraud case. It means the difference between he said, she said, and evidence that can't be explained away. It means one widow's courage becomes 47 families' justice. At 7 p.m., Ramona's email arrived. One attachment, audio file, 437. Vernon and I sat at my desk and listened. Stellan's voice came through muffled but clear enough. Cold, methodical. Nothing like the warm tone I remembered from family dinners. The April cohort needs to see returns by June 15th, or they'll ask questions. Pull from the August commitments. We have 12 weeks before that gap becomes visible. A pause. Someone responding on the other end of the call. No, the chairman's signature works. Nobody's questioned it yet. If they do, we have the documentation showing he approved the structure in 2022. Another pause. Margaret already moved her allocation. She understands the timing. Tell her daughter to stop calling the office. It looks suspicious when family members check account status weekly. Margaret, Paloma's mother, the woman who'd called me 4 times Monday afternoon. Vernon and I listened to the entire recording twice. Then Vernon stood up without saying anything and walked to the whiteboard I kept in my office for project planning. He handed me a blue marker. Draw it, he said, the same way you'd draw a bridge failure analysis. I looked at the blank white surface. Then I started drawing Thursday's meeting, the way I'd drawn 1,000 bridge failures. For engineering students, identify the load-bearing member, calculate the exact pressure point, and the rest collapses. According to physics, not anger. Entry point 2 p.m. Thursday. Stellan arrives with Todd Brennan. First load-bearing moment. Present the document. A settlement agreement requiring his signature to restore fund access. Structural weak point. Stellan's pattern of signing without reading same character flaw from 2018. Collapse sequence. He signs. Celeste witnesses as federal notary. Document becomes legally binding confession. Recording equipment, Vernon said, looking at the diagram. Professional quality. We'll need it installed before they arrive. Agreed, I said. And Celeste? Adjacent room. Ready to enter as notary public when the document is presented. Illinois one-party consent means everything said in that room is admissible. Vernon studied the whiteboard for a long minute. Do you think he'll bring Todd Brennan? He asked. Certainly, I said. He'll want his lawyer there to review everything to make sure his father isn't tricking him. Then he'll be more careful tomorrow. Vernon said, more cautious. I looked at the diagram, at the pattern I'd watched for 34 years, at the same overconfidence that had led my son to sign a founding agreement in 2018 without legal review because he thought he understood everything better than everyone else. Or more confident, I said. Careful and confident look exactly alike until they suddenly don't. Vernon started gathering his things to leave. Stopped at the office door and looked at the whiteboard one more time, the diagram showing every decision point, every moment where Stellan would have to choose between reading carefully and assuming he already knew what the document said. You think he'll read it before signing? Vernon asked. I studied the board. The entry point, the load-bearing moment, the structural weak point that had been there since he was 19 years old, signing papers without reading them, trusting that rules bent for the right people. No, I said. He'll be too busy proving he's smarter than everyone in the room. Vernon nodded slowly. Good, he said. Then the trap is perfect. The trap was perfect. By Thursday at 8 a.m., I needed to make sure the execution was equally precise. The technician arrived at exactly 8 to install the recording equipment in the neutral 28th floor office I'd rented for this meeting. Not my penthouse, not my territory. A space where every sound and word would be captured under Illinois one-party consent law. Marcus Sterling was the specialist Vernon had hired. He asked no questions, worked with professional efficiency, and by 10 a.m. had concealed audio and video recording equipment in ways that would hold up under any legal scrutiny. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was designed to capture truth. Celeste positioned herself in the adjacent room with her notary seal and federal certification documents ready. At 9:47 a.m. my phone rang. Todd Brennan. Mr. Ashford, he said with careful professional courtesy, confirming our 2 p.m. meeting today. I wanted to inform you that Stellan will be accompanied by an independent witness for documentation purposes. Professional protocol. I sat very still. An independent witness for documentation purposes. In 40 years of contract negotiations, I'd never heard that phrase used by someone planning to negotiate honestly. Understood, I said. I'll see you at 2. I hung up and looked at Vernon, who'd been listening from across the room. He's not coming to negotiate, I said. He's coming to stage evidence. His witness will document me threatening or coercing him counter evidence for his fabricated November 2022 narrative. Vernon nodded slowly. Then he's still thinking he can control this. Yes, I said, which means the trap will work exactly as designed. At 11:48 a.m. Vernon knocked softly on the office door. Elevators going up, he said quietly. 2 people. I stood, adjusted my tie. Looked in the small wall mirror mounted near the door. 60 years old, gray hair at the temples, forehead wrinkles deepening with every year. The face of a man who'd built 23 bridges that still stood today. I thought today I'm going to let one collapse exactly the way I designed it to. At noon, the door opened. Stellan entered wearing a navy blue suit. His face showed exhaustion beneath the calculating eyes. The look of someone who'd spent 4 days without sleeping well, planning every angle, preparing every contingency. Behind him came a man I didn't recognize. Dad, Stellan said. His voice already had that trembling quality, the performance beginning before he'd even sat down. Thank you for agreeing to meet. The other man stepped forward, extending his hand. Derek Whitmore, he said with a firm handshake and an expressionless face. Independent documentation consultant. I'm here purely to observe and take contemporaneous notes of this meeting for clarity. I shook his hand, studied his face for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register professional neutrality, short enough not to seem suspicious. We sat at the dark wood table, 4 leather chairs, window overlooking Lakeshore Drive to my left. Stellan across from me. Derek Whitmore 2 chairs away, hands folded on the table, saying nothing. Stellan began immediately. Dad, I need you to understand something, he said, and his voice carried that trembling note of manufactured vulnerability. Paloma's family, they pushed me into decisions I didn't fully understand. I was in over my head. The fund structure, the investor commitments, He paused, looked down at his hands. I didn't know how to tell you I needed help. You'd built this incredible career, and I thought if I asked for help, you'd see me as a failure. It was a good performance, practiced. The kind of narrative that would play well on video if someone wanted to show a father pressuring his vulnerable son. I said nothing, just watched him. And while I watched, 40 years of engineering training drew my eye to an anomaly, a small rhythmic light pulse at the base of Derek Whitmore's shirt collar, right where the fabric met his tie, approximately 5 millimeters in diameter. The subtle flash pattern of a professional-grade microcamera lens. When you inspect bridges for structural flaws, you learn to spot the 5 mm crack that will become the 5-meter failure. The same eye that saved lives in concrete now saw the tiny lens that would decide this case. I kept my face completely neutral, let my eyes move back to Stellan as if I'd noticed nothing. But I understood now. Stellan wasn't just here to negotiate or to threaten with his November 2022 fabricated evidence. He was staging a scene, recording it, building video documentation where I would appear to be blackmailing or coercing him evidence to support his claim that he'd always been following his father's mastermind instructions. Derek Whitmore wasn't taking notes. He was wearing a camera, and Stellan had no idea that I could see it. I want to make this right. Stellan continued, his voice gaining strength as he found his rhythm. If we can work together, if you can help me restore the fund operations, I'll make sure every investor gets their money back. I'll fix everything. I just need your help, Dad. The camera lens pulsed again, a tiny red indicator light there and gone in less than a second. The kind of malfunction that happens with poorly concealed professional equipment when the battery runs warm. My son was so focused on performing his victim narrative that he hadn't noticed his documentation consultant had brought malfunctioning equipment. I had a choice in that moment: reveal that I'd spotted the camera, call out the deception, end the meeting before it began, or let him keep recording the scene he thought would save him. I kept my face neutral, reached across the table for the document I'd prepared, the one that Celeste had drafted with legal precision, the one that said exactly what it needed to say in exactly the right language. I'm glad you want to make this right, I said calmly. I have something here that will help us clarify the governance structure. Just need your signature to confirm the details. Stellan's eyes flickered to the document, then to Derek Whitmore's impassive face, then back to me. The camera lens pulsed once more. Both of us had come armed with cameras. Only one of us knew the other had one too. I slid the document across the table. Stellan reached for the pen without asking to read it first. That's when I knew he believed he'd already won. This clarifies the fund governance structure, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Just need your signature to confirm the details we discussed. Stellan glanced at the title page, saw words like Alpha Nexus and governance and confirmation. His eyes didn't move past the first line. He was too busy calculating how this document would play in Derek Whitmore's hidden camera, how it would look like his father was forcing him to sign away control, coercing him into admitting culpability. He picked up the pen. Before you sign, I said, we need a notary present, legal requirement. I stood and walked to the adjacent room door, knocked twice. Celeste Farrell entered carrying her federal notary seal and a leather portfolio. She was wearing a dark blue suit, her certification credentials visible on a lanyard around her neck. Good afternoon, she said with professional courtesy. I'm here to notarize signatures. Please state your full legal name for the record. Stellan looked at her, then at me, then back at the document. But he'd already decided, already committed. The camera in Whitmore's collar was recording. He needed to show himself being pressured, being coerced, signing under duress from his domineering father. Stellan Ashford, he said clearly. He signed. The notary stamp made 3 distinct sounds. Pressure ink release. Celeste's hand moved with bureaucratic precision. Stellan's hidden camera captured it all the moment he documented his own confession. Thank you, Celeste said. She placed her seal on the document, signed her name as witnessing notary, and dated it June 20th, 2024, 12:23 p.m. Then she stood back. Would you like a certified copy? She asked Stellan. Yes, he said, still performing confidence for the camera. Celeste made a copy on the small printer I'd set up in the corner, handed it to Stellan. He glanced at it, still not reading beyond the title. That's when Todd Brennan, who'd been standing silently near the window, walked over and took the copy from Stellan's hands. He read the first paragraph, stopped, read it again, looked at Stellan with an expression I'd seen before on the faces of engineers who'd just realized a bridge calculation was wrong and the structure was already built. You signed this, Todd said quietly. Stellan frowned. It's the governance clarification, Dad said. Todd read aloud. I, Stellan Ashford, hereby acknowledge and confess that I, acting as sole Chief Executive Officer of Alpha Nexus Capital Management, knowingly and deliberately misrepresented the fund's investment structure to current and prospective investors, falsely claiming legitimate returns while operating a fraudulent scheme, commonly known as a Ponzi structure, wherein he stopped reading. Stellan's face went white. He grabbed the copy from Todd's hands, started reading. His lips moved silently as his eyes scanned the paragraphs he should have read before signing. You told me this was asset mediation, Stellan said, his voice rising. You said we were going to resolve. I said we'd resolve it today, I replied calmly. We have. Todd Brennan looked at the notarized original in Celeste's hands, then at Stellan, then at me. He picked up his briefcase. I'm no longer representing you, he said to Stellan. Don't call me. Don't contact my office. Find another attorney. He walked out without another word. Derek Whitmore sat frozen in his chair, hands still folded on the table, the camera in his collar still recording. Recording his client signing a confession. Recording the moment Stellan realized what he'd done. Recording evidence that would destroy any claim of coercion or duress. Stellan stood up. The paper shook in his hands. This won't hold up, he said. I'll claim coercion. I'll say you threatened me, forced me to. Your witness recorded the entire meeting, I said, gesturing to Derek Whitmore. The footage will show I never threatened you, never raised my voice, simply presented a document, and you signed it without reading. The same thing you did in 2018 when I gave you $3 million. Stellan looked at Derek, then at the tiny camera lens in his collar that he must have known was there but had forgotten in his panic. Get out, Stellan said to Derek. His voice was shaking now. Not performance, real fear. Get out, both of you, now. Derek stood, left without speaking. Vernon, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner as my witness, stood as well. Vernon, I said, please escort Mr. Whitmore out. Make sure he understands that the recording device he's carrying is now evidence in a federal fraud case. Vernon nodded, followed Derek out. I looked at Stellan, my son, 35 years old, standing in an empty office holding a notarized confession that would send him to prison. Why, he asked, not angry now, just empty. Why did you do this? I thought about Elaine's diary, about her stolen cancer treatment fund, about Ramona Garrison in her ICU uniform, about 46 other families. Because someone had to, I said. I walked out. Celeste followed with the original notarized document in her portfolio. 3 hours later, I sat alone in that empty rented office. The afternoon sun cut through the windows in geometric blocks. The chairs where 6 people had sat were arranged like a crime scene. One water bottle remained on the table, half empty, unclaimed. I had one, I had the confession, I had Derek Whitmore's camera footage, I had Ramona's recording, I had Vernon's documentation, I had everything I needed to deliver my son to federal prosecution. So why was I crying? I sat there for 30 minutes, just crying, no sound, just tears running down my face in the empty office while the sun moved across the floor. Then I took out my phone, scrolled to my photos, found the one from 27 years ago. Stellan at 8 years old, wearing an oversized yellow construction helmet at one of my building sites. Bring your child to work day. He was beaming at the camera, so proud to be wearing his dad's helmet, so excited to see the bridges his father built. You wanted to be just like me, I said to the photo. And I taught you that people who steal should be held accountable. I just never imagined you'd be the thief. I sat there until the sun dropped below the buildings and the office went dark. I had everything I needed to destroy my son. Tomorrow I'd take it to the FBI. Tonight I'd let myself be a father one last time. Friday morning I drove to the Dirksen Federal Building with Celeste. The evidence files sat in a leather briefcase on the back seat, 7 months of private investigation, Vernon's forensic audit, Thursday's notarized confession, Ramona's recording. Everything needed to destroy my son. The FBI briefing room had no windows, which seemed appropriate for a meeting where I'd hand over evidence to bury my own son. Senior FBI agent Russell Thorne was waiting. Mid-50s gray suit, the kind of methodical precision that comes from 20 years reviewing financial crime cases. He shook my hand, gestured to chairs at a metal table, and opened a folder that was already thick with documents. Mr. Ashford, he said, thank you for coming in. Let's start with what you have. Celeste placed my briefcase on the table. I opened it and began laying out files. 7-month private detective investigation, I said. Corporate finance specialists. They tracked Alpha Nexus operations from November through May. Russell reviewed the first file, nodded. Forensic audit from an independent CPA. I continued sliding Vernon's report across the table. Complete analysis of the Ponzi structure. 3 tiers. New investor money, paying returns to earlier investors. Russell spent 5 minutes on that one, made notes. This, I said, placing the notarized confession in front of him, Signed Thursday, my son acknowledging fraudulent misrepresentation, witnessed by a federal notary public. Russell read it carefully. His expression didn't change, but I saw his pen move faster across his notepad. And this? I finished sliding my phone across the table with Ramona's recording cued. 4 minutes, 37 seconds. Recorded April 24th at a Marriott Hotel seminar. My son discussing fund structure, investor cohorts, and transfer timing with complete awareness of the fraudulent scheme. Russell listened to the entire recording. Then he closed his folder and looked at me directly. We've been tracking Alpha Nexus for 5 months, he said. Independent investigation started in January when a compliance analyst flagged unusual return patterns. Your son's scheme, your daughter-in-law's offshore accounts, we have enough evidence for arrest warrants for both of them. I sat very still. You just gave us the missing piece, Russell continued. The confession and the seminar recording, those close gaps in our timeline, make the case prosecutable instead of just suspicious. He paused. You understand your name will appear in the investigation file. The press will connect you to this. We'll work to clean your record completely, prove you were a victim of identity fraud and forgery, but there'll be noise first. Public noise. Your name in headlines. The federal hallway's fluorescent lights ran perfectly straight, leaving no shadows. 40 years I'd designed buildings for light to pass through cleanly. Today I walked through one where light allowed nothing to hide. I understand, I said. We'll move on the warrants within 72 hours, Russell said. Once we execute arrests, this becomes very public very quickly. He stood, shook my hand again. Thank you for coming forward, he said. Most fathers wouldn't. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and left. At 3 p.m., I was back at Celeste's office on LaSalle Street when her computer chimed with a news alert. She read it. Her face went tight. There's an article, she said quietly. Chicago Financial Wire, published 11 minutes ago. She turned the screen toward me. The headline, Senior Infrastructure Engineer Accused of Manipulating Investment Funds. I read the first paragraph. Anonymous sources, close to the Alpha Nexus investigation, cite internal documents showing improper handling of family assets by veteran engineer Lester Ashford, whose name appears on founding documents for the troubled investment fund. Sources suggest Ashford may have directed his son's business operations while maintaining public distance to avoid regulatory scrutiny. My phone started ringing. I looked at the screen. A former colleague from the Interstate 94 project. I declined the call. It rang again. A business partner from 2015. Declined. Again. A reporter from Chicago Tribune. Declined. He got to press before FBI could act, I said. 40 years of reputation dragged into public controversy in 4 hours. My phone vibrated 17 times in 4 minutes. Each buzz felt like another 40-year relationship asking for explanation. I turned the phone face down on Celeste's desk. The buzzing continued through the wood. We need to issue a response statement, Celeste said. Something brief, denying involvement, noting you've cooperated with federal investigators. No, I said. She looked at me. 40 years, I said. 40 years I didn't need press releases to know whether I was right or wrong about a structural decision. Not starting now. Let the FBI do their job. When they clear my name, it'll matter more than any statement I could write today. Celeste studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. All right, she said, but the calls won't stop, and the article will spread. By tonight, everyone in the Chicago engineering community will have read it. I know, I said. She refreshed the article page, scrolled down. 83 comments already, she said. Most of them from people who've worked with you, some defending, some questioning, some, she trailed off. Some calling me a fraud, I finished. I can imagine. My phone buzzed again. I looked at the screen. The name stopped me, Ernest Holbrook, Paloma's father, the auditing engineer I'd failed to defend 21 years ago at the Harrington Crossing project. The man whose career had ended because I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I stared at his name for 3 rings. Then I answered, Mr. Holbrook, I said. Mr. Ashford. His voice was older than I remembered. Tired. I saw the article. I needed to call. I waited. I know things, Ernest said slowly. About my daughter. About what she's done. Things I should have told someone a long time ago. Things that might help you now. Celeste was watching my face. I'm listening, I said. Ernest's call lasted 12 minutes. What he told me about Paloma confirmed suspicions I'd been building for months. By 9 p.m. that same Friday evening, another piece of the puzzle arrived at my door. Vernon stood in my penthouse doorway holding a manila envelope like it might explode. Can I come in, he asked. I stepped aside. He walked to the kitchen table and set the envelope down carefully. Sat down without being asked. I poured 2 glasses of water and joined him. I need to tell you something, Vernon said. The whole truth, not the version I gave you Tuesday, the complete truth. I waited. 15 years ago, Vernon began. I signed a falsified financial report for Stellan's first company. He was 19, fresh from college, working at that accounting firm in Evanston. There was a client report significant classification error. If it got reported formally, the firm would lose their biggest account, maybe fold. He picked up the water glass, but didn't drink. I was the external auditor reviewing their work. Stellan brought me the problem privately. Said he didn't want to destroy the firm over a technical issue. I made it go away quietly. Signed off on the corrected version. Let them proceed with their IPO. The company went public successfully. Vernon opened the manila envelope like a man defusing a bomb he'd built himself 15 years ago. Each document a wire he'd crossed, hoping no one would notice. Someone noticed. That was the transgression I mentioned Sunday, he said. The mistake I made helping your son. But there's more. He pulled out a small digital recorder, set it on the table between us. The past 3 weeks, Vernon continued, Stellan's been calling me, not for advice, not for friendship, to pressure me for sensitive information about your finances, your meeting schedules, your investment activities. Said he needed ammunition to counter FBI investigation. What did you give him? I asked. Nothing sensitive, Vernon said. Only your public schedule, things anyone could find. But I recorded every call he made, every attempt to coerce information using my 15-year mistake as leverage. He pushed the recorder toward me. I gave copies to my personal lawyer 2 weeks ago, Vernon said. Before I even called you Sunday morning, I was preparing, documenting, building my own case file in case everything came out. I looked at him across the table. My friend of 30 years. The man who'd reviewed my bridge calculations, attended my wife's funeral, stood beside me through 4 decades of professional decisions. You had those recordings 2 weeks before calling me. Sunday morning, I said slowly. You prepared your defense before you knew what I'd do. Vernon met my eyes. I didn't know what you'd do, he said. But I knew what I'd do. I knew I couldn't keep covering for your son. I knew eventually I'd have to choose between 30 years of friendship and doing the right thing, so I prepared for both possibilities. We sat in silence for a long minute. Thank you, I said finally, for telling me, for recording those calls, for choosing right. Saturday morning at 9:30, Vernon and I sat in Celeste's office. She'd reviewed the recordings overnight, listened to all of Stellan's coercive calls, analyzed Vernon's legal exposure. 15-year-old audit misconduct, Celeste said, looking at her notes. Federal statute of limitations is 5 years. You're well past that threshold. The offense itself is no longer prosecutable. Vernon exhaled slowly. But Celeste continued, voluntary reporting to the SEC combined with full cooperation on the Alpha Nexus investigation changes your position from suspect to cooperative witness. Add your status as blackmail victim, which these recordings clearly document, and you're looking at highly likely complete prosecution exemption. She set down her pen. The SEC will want you to report what you did in 2009. Acknowledge the falsified audit. But in exchange for that honesty and your cooperation, now they'll almost certainly grant immunity. Vernon looked at me, then back at Celeste. I'll do it, he said. Today, if possible. I stood, reached across the desk and shook Vernon's hand. 30 years of friendship sat in that handshake. 15 years of guilt. 3 weeks of blackmail. 5 minutes of legal analysis that gave Vernon his life back. Mathematics of redemption. You've been my friend for 30 years, I said. You made a mistake 15 years ago. I made a mistake 20 years ago at Harrington Crossing. We're not perfect, but today we're doing the right thing. Vernon's eyes were wet. He nodded. Celeste started gathering paperwork for the SEC filing. Vernon stood to leave, paused at the office door. Do you think he'll try to escape? He asked quietly. Before FBI executes the warrants, I thought about Stellan's calculating voice on Ramona's recording, about the offshore accounts, about the way he'd prepared fabricated evidence 2 years in advance. He's thinking about it, I said, planning it, considering every angle. And his wife? Vernon asked. Paloma. Her too. Vernon looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You knew about his wife already, he asked, that she's part of the scheme, that she's been involved from the beginning. I nodded. Some things I know before I need to say them. Vernon studied my face for 5 long seconds. Then he walked out without another word. He'd been my friend for 30 years, but standing there watching him leave, I realized he'd never truly known me at all. The FBI email arrived at 2:47 p.m. on Saturday with a subject line that made my coffee taste like ash. Alpha Nexus Financial Investigation Summary Preliminary. I'd been sitting on my back deck in Chicago, watching sparrows fight over territory in the oak tree, when my phone chimed. The afternoon sun felt too warm suddenly, too bright. I opened the message with the careful deliberation of a man who'd spent 40 years reading structural stress reports, knowing that some documents changed everything. The email was clinical, professional. 3 paragraphs that dismantled whatever remained of the family I'd thought I knew. Paloma Holbrook had transferred $9.4 million to a Cayman Islands account 3 months before Alpha Nexus collapsed. The FBI had traced the transactions during their 5-month investigation, wire transfers carefully structured to avoid immediate detection, routed through 2 intermediary banks before landing in an account opened in her name 6 months before the fund even showed stress. 3 months before the collapse, while I'd been holding Elaine's hand through her final round of chemo, Paloma had been moving money offshore. While Stellan had been assuring me the fund was solid, his wife had been building an escape hatch. I set my coffee down before I could throw it. The mug left a ring on the teak table that would probably stain. I didn't care. The FBI hadn't learned about the offshore account from me. They'd discovered it independently subpoenaed bank records, international wire transfer databases, the kind of financial forensics that left no shadow unexamined. I was just being informed as a courtesy a witness who'd already provided testimony. The investigation had moved past me into territories I couldn't touch. I thought about Paloma at dinner parties, the way she'd smiled when people told stories about Elaine, sympathetic, warm, her hand resting on Stellan's arm like she was anchoring him through difficult memories. She'd attended Elaine's memorial service in a black dress with pearl earrings, had hugged me afterward and whispered she was an extraordinary woman. At 3 months, she'd known for 3 months that everything was about to implode. Had known while I'd written those checks from Elaine's fund, believing we were still family. Had known and said nothing. $9.4 million. I'd built bridges designed to hold 10,000 tons. I'd never calculated the weight of betrayal denominated in offshore accounts and dinner party smiles. I read the email 4 times, searching for misinterpretation for some nuance I'd missed. The language didn't change. The numbers didn't shift. Paloma had stolen $9.4 million and fled to Portugal, while Stellan took the public fall. Except maybe it wasn't just Stellan taking the fall. Maybe it was Stellan being left holding the bag. The thought settled into my chest like rebar, cold and structural. I'd been so focused on my son's guilt I hadn't considered the geometry of his wife's escape. The timing was too precise, the planning too sophisticated. 3 months advance warning suggested someone had been monitoring the fund's instability long before it became critical. Someone with access to internal projections and cash flow models. Someone married to the founder. I sat on that deck until the sparrows went quiet, and the shadows stretched long across the lawn. The FBI email stayed open on my phone, blue light in the gathering dusk. Stellan called Sunday morning at 8:15 a.m. I almost didn't answer. My phone screen showed his name, just Stellan. No photo, no emoji, and my thumb hovered over decline. But something in the persistence of the ring made me swipe to accept. Dad, his voice came through rough, desperate in a way I'd never heard. Dad, please, I need you to listen. I'm listening, I said. My own voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, flat, administrative. Paloma didn't know. Whatever they're telling you, whatever they found, she didn't know about the fund. She wouldn't... He broke off, breathing hard. She's not part of this. I swear to God, Dad, she's not part of this. I watched a cardinal land on my porch, railing impossibly red against the white paint. The FBI says she transferred $9.4 million to the Cayman Islands 3 months before Alpha Nexus collapsed. Silence on the line. Long enough I could hear traffic in the background wherever he was calling from. City sounds, horns, the mechanical beep of a crosswalk signal. Stellan, I said quietly. She knew, and she took the money, and she left. I know. His voice cracked on both words, not the calculated break of someone playing for sympathy, but the actual sound of a 35-year-old man realizing there's no door left to walk through. I know, Dad, I know. The cardinal flew away. I watched it disappear into the oak tree where the sparrows had been fighting yesterday. Then why are you calling me? I asked. Another pause. Longer. I could hear him trying to gather words, trying to assemble some explanation that would make sense of the geometry between us. I know, he whispered again, just that. I know. 17 seconds of silence followed. I counted them. Old habit from construction sites. Timing concrete pours, measuring cure rates, calculating the intervals that mattered. The line didn't disconnect. It just stayed open, empty air between Illinois and wherever my son was standing until finally it went dead. Not hung up, just ended, like everything else between us. I sat with the dead phone in my hand for another 3 minutes before setting it down on the kitchen counter. The screen had gone black. Sunday afternoon light filtered through the windows, turning everything the color of old photographs. Sunday night, I allowed myself the only weakness I'd permit in this entire ordeal. I opened Elaine's diary to the final page she ever wrote. I'd kept it in my nightstand drawer for 16 months since the funeral. Black leather edges, worn from 23 years of her handwriting. I'd read it once the week after she died, but grief had made the words blur into abstract shapes. Tonight, I needed to see them clearly. The entry was dated March 8th, 2023, 5 days before she passed. Her handwriting had deteriorated. By then, the morphine made her grip uncertain letters, tilting like buildings in wind shear. But the words were precise. Lester will blame himself. He always does when structures fail, even the ones he didn't build. But this isn't his fault. I spoiled Stellan, gave him everything he wanted because I couldn't bear to see him struggle the way Lester struggled. Made him weak when I should have made him strong. My throat closed. I had to stop reading, but my eyes kept moving down the page. Don't blame me. He never had to suffer consequences of own actions. Save him with truth. That was it. The final sentence she ever wrote. 3 days later, she'd been too weak to hold a pen. 5 days later, she was gone. I folded the diary closed and looked at her portrait on the dresser. The one from our 30th anniversary. Her smile warm and certain in a way that had always made the world feel manageable. You knew all along, I said to the photograph. My voice came out rough, unfamiliar. You forgave me before I understood what needed forgiving. You're just like always, right when I needed you to be. I cried then. First time since the funeral. Not the broken sobbing of acute grief, but the steady structural release of a man who'd been holding load-bearing weight for 16 months and finally understood he could set it down. Elaine had known, had seen Stellan's character forming over decades of small choices and necessary consequences I'd overruled. Had watched me try to protect our son from every sharp edge in the world, and had understood before I did that protection without accountability was just another name for destruction. Save him with truth, she'd written. Not with money, not with lawyers, not with the kind of rescue that left him thinking he could always be saved. I folded the diary closed for the last time. 23 years of her handwriting, 40 years of marriage before that. All of it leading to one sentence I should have understood decades ago: save him with truth, not protection. Monday morning, I put on my oldest suit. The navy blue Brooks Brothers I'd worn to sign my first major contract 35 years ago, the Interstate 294 expansion that had launched my career. It still fit, though. The shoulders felt tighter now. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar from the garment bag, where it had hung untouched for a decade. Not to celebrate. To remember where I'd started when I still believed precision mattered more than mercy. I left the penthouse at 9:47 a.m. and walked 4 blocks to the coffee shop on West Adams. Small place, 8 tables, ceramic mugs instead of paper cups. I'd been coming here for 15 years. The barista knew my order. Black coffee, no room, but didn't know my name. That kind of anonymous routine Chicago did better than anywhere. I chose the window seat facing north. From here I could see the Alpha Nexus building 4 blocks away, 23 floors of steel and glass where my son had built his empire of sophisticated theft. At 10:03 a.m., Russell Thorne had told me FBI agents would execute the arrest warrant. I'd chosen to be here instead of there. Some things a father shouldn't witness, even when he's the one who made them necessary. The coffee shop's ceramic mug was the same style I'd held for 15 years coming to this location. My phone buzzed once at 10:17 a.m. The mug stayed steady in my hand. 40 years of engineering hands don't shake when structures finally fail on schedule. Mr. Ashford, Russell's voice came through with the controlled neutrality of a man delivering scheduled results. It's done. Your son at his office 10:03. Daughter-in-law at O'Hare Gate C 171004. Both in custody. I watched a bus pass outside the window. Red line heading south. Thank you, Agent Thorne. Your testimony was essential to building the case. The warrant for Mrs. Ashford for Paloma Holbrook that came from our independent investigation. She was attempting to board a flight to Grand Cayman when we took her. Had a one-way ticket and 2 suitcases. 2 suitcases and $9.4 million in an offshore account. My son's wife running. I appreciate you informing me, I said. You did the right thing. Russell paused. I know that doesn't make it easier. No, I agreed, but it makes it possible. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the table. Through the window, I could see the Alpha Nexus building catching morning light glass reflecting clouds, and sky like nothing had changed. But inside, FBI agents would be processing the scene, reading my son his Miranda rights, photographing his office, boxing evidence. The coffee in my mug had gone lukewarm, but I lifted it anyway. First coffee in 9 days I could drink without something pressing on my chest. Not relief, not victory, just absence of weight. I took another sip. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but I finished it anyway. Through the window, I could see Alpha Nexus, 4 blocks north, probably FBI agents, still processing the scene, boxing evidence, reading my son his rights. I ordered a second cup. The barista asked if I wanted anything else. No, I said, I have everything I need. The second cup was better than the first. I left the coffee shop at 2:17 p.m. and walked to Celeste Farrell's office on LaSalle Street. Celeste asked me Monday afternoon how much of my personal assets I wanted to protect in the legal proceedings, and I answered with a number that made her put down her pen. Everything, I said. Penthouse investment accounts, retirement fund. Supplement the victim compensation along with the Alpha Nexus frozen assets and the 9.4 million recovered from Paloma's account. Her office hadn't changed in 30 years. Same mahogany desk, same skyline view, same leather chairs that had witnessed countless contract negotiations. But this conversation was different. We weren't discussing infrastructure projects. We were discussing how to dismantle a life I'd spent 4 decades building. Celeste set her pen down with deliberate care. She was 52, sharp-featured, silver-streaked hair in a tight bun. We'd worked together since 1994. Lester. She used my first name, which she only did when she was about to argue. Legally, you're not obligated to do that. You're a victim here, too. Your reputation, your name dragged into... My name is on that fund's records, I interrupted. Even if it's fake, my name is still there. I can't live with that. Your son forged your signature. The FBI confirmed it. No court would hold you financially responsible. 47 families, I said. The number sat between us like structural steel. 47 families lost everything because my son used my name to build credibility for a fraud. I don't care what the court says I'm legally required to do. Celeste clicked her pen twice her tell when processing something she disagreed with but couldn't change. Walk me through the math. I'd done the calculations 3 times over the weekend. The penthouse will sell for approximately $4.2 million. Investment accounts total $1.8 million. Retirement fund, another $2.6 million. That's $8.6 million for my personal assets. Combined with the frozen Alpha Nexus operational accounts, the FBI estimates $12 million recoverable, and Paloma's offshore account, we're looking at approximately $30 million total for victim compensation. And you'll keep $340,000, I said, plus my pension. Celeste wrote the numbers in her precise hand. 40 years of building things reduced to 1 studio apartment and groceries. That's not enough, she said quietly. 30 million against 47 million in documented losses. The victims will still only recover about 64 cents on the dollar. I know, but it's everything I have that I can give without becoming a burden to anyone else. 340,000 and a pension will keep me housed and fed. That's sufficient. I'd spent 40 years calculating load-bearing capacities for steel and concrete. Never calculated how much weight a name could hold before it needed structural support from everything I'd ever built. Celeste stood and walked to the window, her back to me. Outside LaSalle Street ran through the financial district like a canyon of glass and steel buildings I'd helped make possible through infrastructure projects, weight distributed across foundations I'd helped engineer. Your name wasn't just on the fund records, she said. It was your reputation, your 40-year career. The fact that you'd never defaulted on a contract, Never cut corners, never compromised on safety standards. That's what Stellan stole. That's what he weaponized. Yes. And you think giving away your assets repairs that? No, I said, but it's the only structural support I can provide. You can't rebuild credibility with apologies. You need concrete and steel. She turned back. The victims, they'll still be angry. 64 cents on the dollar isn't whole. It's not justice. Justice would require time travel, I said. This is just math. Before I reveal the exact paperwork she prepared next. Are you still here? Comment. A, if you think I should have kept more assets, or B, if this was the right choice. Add one short reason. Please note what follows contains recreated details. For narrative purposes, the message is what I hope stays with you. Celeste returned to her desk and opened her laptop. I'll need to coordinate with the FBI's Victim Compensation Administrator, draft the asset liquidation orders, file with the court for approval, probably schedule a hearing. How long? 6 to 8 weeks for the penthouse sale. The investment and retirement accounts can transfer faster, maybe 3 weeks once the court approves. Figure 2 months total. 2 months. I tried to imagine waking up in the penthouse knowing I'd already sold it, eating breakfast at a table that belonged to someone else. I'll need to find an apartment, I said. Celeste's fingers moved across the keyboard, drafting asset liquidation orders. Click, click, click. Each keystroke another decade of savings converted to restitution. She didn't ask if I was sure. She knew. The typing filled her office. Mechanical, precise, irreversible. I watched her work, watched the document take shape on her screen. Legal language transforming 40 years of accumulated wealth into court-ordered compensation. She'd been drafting documents for me since 1994. Partnership agreements, liability waivers, contract amendments. This was different. This was the sound of everything I'd built being systematically converted to numbers in someone else's ledger. 340,000, she said without looking up. That's your line. Everything above that line goes to the victims. Everything below stays with you. Yes. And your pension. And my pension. She kept typing. I stood and walked to the window. The same view I'd seen dozens of times over 30 years, discussing contracts worth millions, negotiating terms that would shape city infrastructure for decades. Through the glass, I could see my reflection against the Chicago skyline, and behind it, Celeste was still working her fingers, moving with the steady rhythm of someone who'd done this for 3 decades. I stood at Celeste's office window, looking down at LaSalle Street, the same view I'd seen dozens of times over 30 years, discussing contracts worth millions. Tomorrow I'd start searching for a studio apartment I could afford on $340,000 and a pension. Through my reflection in the glass, I could see Celeste still typing. The sound of my life being legally dismantled one clause at a time. She finished typing at 4:47 p.m. I signed the documents. She printed 8 pages of asset liquidation orders that would take everything I'd spent 40 years building and convert it into restitution for 47 families I'd never met. The pen was a Mont Blanc I'd received for my 30th anniversary at the firm. I left it on her desk when I walked out. The FBI's official statement went public. July 2nd at 9 a.m., and by noon, the press article accusing me of financial manipulation had vanished from the internet like it never existed. I was in my new apartment when I saw the news ground floor studio in Wicker Park, 400 square feet, 1 window, facing an alley, where pigeons fought over scraps. The FBI statement was comprehensive. Stellan Ashford charged with securities fraud, money laundering, and systematic document falsification. My name appeared in paragraph 7. Lester Ashford cooperated fully with the investigation and is not implicated in any criminal activity. Forensic analysis confirms all documents bearing his signature were forged without his knowledge or consent. Paragraph 7. 40 years of reputation destroyed in 4 hours, restored in 48. But I'd remember both timelines equally forever. The press reversed course with the efficiency of people who'd never believed their own reporting in the first place. The Chicago Tribune ran a correction. The financial blogs updated their articles. By 2 p.m., the original accusatory piece had been scrubbed from search engines like it had never existed. Digital erasure. As if credibility could be unbuilt as easily as it was demolished. Ramona Garrison called at 3:17 p.m. crying. I just received the notification, she said through tears I could hear catching in her throat. 100% compensation, Everything Harold invested. I don't know how to thank you. That's your money, Ramona, I told her. It's always been yours. But your assets, I read about what you did. You didn't have to. Yes, I said. I did. She cried for another minute while I stood in my studio apartment, holding a phone against my ear, looking at the alley, where pigeons scattered and regrouped in patterns that seemed purposeful but weren't. When she hung up, the apartment was quiet again. 400 square feet. No echo. Sound just died against the walls. Vernon showed up Saturday morning, July 6th, to help me move out of the penthouse. We'd arranged it a week earlier. He'd taken the train up from Springfield, refused my offer to pay for his time, brought his own truck. The penthouse had sold in 11 days. 4.2 million to a tech executive who'd made his money in cryptocurrency and wanted a place with a view. He'd walked through, once nodded at the skyline, and made an offer the same day. I'd lived there for 23 years. He decided it was worth buying in 45 minutes. Vernon and I worked mostly in silence. He was 74, still strong enough to carry boxes down 34 floors of elevator rides without complaint. We'd packed most of the furniture into storage. The buyer wanted the place empty, but I'd kept a few things. Elaine's books, her green woolen scarf, the silver hand mirror she'd used every morning. I opened the box marked Elaine Personal and stopped. Vernon was across the room, taping another carton shut, but he must have heard something change in my breathing because he set the tape down and walked over. He looked into the box, the scarf folded on top, the mirror wrapped in tissue paper beneath 3 hardcover books she'd never finished reading, and placed one hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything for maybe 30 seconds. Then he reached into the box and lifted out the green woolen scarf with both hands, holding it like it weighed more than fabric should weigh. She always used this, he asked. Every winter, I said. Even indoors when she got cold reading at night. Vernon folded that green woolen scarf like it was a flag from a funeral I'd been attending in installments for 3 years. Some deaths take longer to finish than others. Some never finish at all. He produced a separate cloth bag from his truck. Later, I'd realized he'd brought it specifically for this purpose, and placed the scarf inside with the kind of care you reserve for things that can't be replaced. This doesn't go in the carton, he said. No, I agreed. We finished packing by 4 p.m., 34 floors up for 23 years. Tomorrow, ground floor studio in Wicker Park. Gravity always wins eventually. The preliminary hearing was mid-August at the Dirksen Federal Building. Courtroom 2506, 5th floor, federal jurisdiction. I sat in the gallery with Celeste, 3 rows behind the prosecution table. The room smelled like floor polish and recycled air. Stellan entered at 9:03 a.m. in an orange jumpsuit and wrist restraints. He'd lost weight, maybe 15 pounds, and his hair was shorter than I'd ever seen it. Prison barber. Standard issue. He didn't look at me when they walked him to the defense table. Judge Margaret Hartwell presided, mid-60s gray hair, pulled back in a bun, measured courtroom demeanor, honed over 30 years on the federal bench. She reviewed the plea agreement without expression. Mr. Ashford, she said, looking directly at Stellan, you understand that by pleading guilty to securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering, you accept a 9-year federal sentence with eligibility for supervised release after 7. Yes, Your Honor, Stellan said. His voice was steady. He'd always been good at performing calm. And you enter this plea voluntarily without coercion. Yes, Your Honor. 9 years. My son was 35. He'd be 44 when released. I'd be 69. If I made it that long. If he wanted to see me. If either of us remembered why this mattered. Judge Hartwell accepted the plea. Paloma had entered hers 3 days earlier, in a separate proceeding, 6 years plus full restitution. The machinery of justice, processing them both with the efficient indifference of systems designed not to care. As the marshals prepared to escort Stellan out, he turned. First time in 9 weeks, I looked my son directly in the eyes. He didn't look away. Neither did I. We just looked at each other across 20 feet of courtroom space that might as well have been the distance between galaxies. The marshals turned Stellan toward the courtroom exit. He paused, turned his head back over his shoulder. Our eyes met one last time. I waited for something, apology, defiance, grief, but his face was blank, just looking. Then he faced forward, and they walked him through the door. Gone. I left the courthouse and walked 14 blocks back to Wicker Park. Didn't take the train. Needed the distance to process what I'd seen in Stellan's face when he turned back. Not apology, not defiance, just the blank acknowledgement that we'd reached the end of whatever we'd been to each other. Celeste handed me the FBI's final investigation report late August, and on page 47, I learned that nearly everything my son told me about his marriage was a lie. I was back in her office on LaSalle Street, same leather chair I'd sat in dozens of times over 30 years, same Chicago skyline through the window. But the document in my hands rewrote the entire architecture of what I thought I'd understood about how my family had fallen apart. Page 47, Celeste said, watching me find it. Paloma's family filed bankruptcy 6 years ago, New York real estate lawsuit. They approached your son thinking he had access to unlimited family wealth. I read the paragraph twice. The language was clinical, investigative, precise. Subject Stellan Ashford told Holbrook family that Father Lester Ashford was an anonymous investor, prepared to provide bailout capital for distressed real estate holdings. Holbrook family, unaware of subject's actual financial position, believed marriage would provide access to family wealth estimated at $50+ million. I looked up. They thought I was going to save them. That's what your son told them, Celeste said. He represented himself as the son of a construction legend with deep pockets. They believed him, and he believed they were wealthy Portuguese expatriates with old money and European connections. Both parties engaged in mutual deception regarding financial resources. Mutual deception, the FBI's phrase for two families building a marriage on lies they told each other about who they were and what they had. Paloma knew, I said, still reading. She knew her family was bankrupt. She knew, Celeste confirmed, the offshore accounts she opened those 18 months into the marriage, long before Alpha Nexus showed stress. She was building an escape plan from the beginning, just in case the wealth she'd married into turned out not to exist. Which it didn't, because Stellan had none. He'd built Alpha Nexus on my forged signature, an investor confidence, and a name I'd spent 40 years making credible. And Paloma had married him believing that name came with unlimited family money she could access when her own family's financial fiction collapsed. Two families, two sets of lies, one child caught in the middle. I thought about Marcus, 4 years old, yellow bike helmet, gaps in his teeth. That child grew up in a house where no one told the truth, not even his father. He learned to live the way the adults around him lived. Your son told them you'd invest, Celeste said quietly. Paloma's father asked to meet you multiple times. Stellan made excuses. You were traveling, you preferred anonymity, you didn't get involved in preliminary discussions. He kept them at distance long enough to get married, and by then they were family. The fiction held. Until it didn't. Until it didn't, she agreed. How do you tell your son to be honest when you've spent 40 years measuring words like load calculations, revealing only what's structurally necessary? You can't. He learns what you do, not what you say. I'd spent 4 decades building a reputation on precision and structural integrity, but I'd never taught Stellan how to tell the truth when it was uncomfortable. I'd taught him how to calculate risk, how to present information in ways that minimized exposure, how to protect himself by controlling what other people knew. He'd learned perfectly, just applied the lessons to fraud instead of engineering. I closed the report and handed it back to Celeste. They're both in prison now. Does it matter anymore who lied to whom? No, she said, but I thought you should know the full geometry. Geometry. The shape of how we'd all failed each other in patterns that looked intentional, but were just compounding errors in human calculation. Vernon showed up early October with lunch from the Greektown restaurant we'd been going to since we were 25. He'd taken the train up from Springfield again, brought 2 containers of moussaka in a paper bag, refused to let me reimburse him for either the train ticket or the food. The Wicker Park apartment was 3rd floor, 5 times smaller than the penthouse. No lake view, just a window that looked out at a street maple tree beginning to turn orange. I'd bought a bed and 1 chair, but hadn't gotten around to a table yet, so we sat on the floor with our backs against the wall, eating Greek food with plastic forks. The moussaka tasted exactly like it did 40 years ago, when Vernon and I were young engineers celebrating our first contracts. Same lamb, same bechamel, same ceramic container. We'd aged, the recipe hadn't. Same moussaka they served 40 years ago, Vernon said, reading my mind the way he'd been doing since 1984. Place hasn't changed the recipe. Some things shouldn't change, I said. We ate in silence for a while. Through the window, I could see the maple tree moving in wind leaves, letting go one at a time, falling to the sidewalk, where people walked past without noticing. Vernon looked around the bare apartment, 400 square feet, scuffed hardwood floors, one chair, no curtains. Do you regret it? I took a long time answering. Wanted to make sure I meant what I said. No. He nodded, waiting. He knew there was more. But I wish I'd done this 10 years earlier, I said. Not about selling the penthouse, about telling the truth. To Stellan, to everyone, to myself. I set down my fork. I spent 40 years being precise with numbers and careful with words. Thought that was integrity. But precision isn't the same thing as honesty. You can be accurate and still not tell the truth about what matters. Vernon looked out the window at the maple tree, considering that. 74 years old, still thinking like an engineer, testing the load-bearing capacity of every statement before accepting it. You told the truth when it counted, he said finally, to the FBI, to the court, to those 47 families. After 40 years of teaching my son that truth was optional if you calculated the risk correctly, I said, he learned that from me, not the fraud, but the idea that you measure words like structural loads and only reveal what's necessary. That's how I lived. That's what he saw. Vernon nodded slowly, looking out the window at the maple tree. Truth's expensive, he said, but lies cost more. Just takes longer to get the bill. He raised his plastic fork. I raised mine. We tapped them together like we'd tapped champagne glasses in that same restaurant 40 years ago. This time the sound was hollow. We finished the moussaka in silence. Vernon took the empty containers with him when he left, told me he'd be back in December. The apartment was quiet. After he was gone, the kind of quiet that used to feel empty, but was starting to feel like just space. The white envelope with the federal prison postmark arrived late October, and I stared at it on my kitchen table for 20 minutes before opening it. The return address was printed in standard institutional format, FCI Terre Haute, Indiana. Stellan's name typed in the upper left corner. The envelope was thin, 1 or 2 pages, nothing more. I held it up to the window light like I could read through the paper without having to actually open it and process what was inside. Finally, I used a butter knife to slit the top. 2 pages handwritten, his engineer's printing, careful and angular. Dad, it started. Not father, not Lester, just Dad. I almost stopped reading there. I'm writing this from the library. They give us 45 minutes twice a week for correspondence. I don't know if you want to hear from me. You don't have to write back. But I wanted to ask how you're doing. The next paragraph was questions. Simple ones. Direct. How is your health? Where are you living now? Are you okay? That was it. No requests for legal help. No pleas for me to contact his lawyer or file an appeal. No blame for turning him in. No manipulation about grandchildren or family obligations. Just 3 questions about my life. I read the letter 4 times looking for the angle. The hidden ask. The emotional leverage he was building towards some request he'd make in the next letter. But it wasn't there. 2 pages. Not once did he ask me to do anything. Just asked about my life. First time in 9 years. Maybe first time ever. I thought about all the phone calls where he'd started with small talk before getting to what he actually wanted. Investment advice, introduction to a contractor, use of my name for credibility with a client. Every conversation had been transactional. Every how are you had been preamble to I need you to. This letter ended with I hope you're okay. If you want to write back, I'm allowed to receive mail. If you don't, I understand. Stellan. I sat at the kitchen table until the afternoon light changed, and the maple tree outside threw different shadows across the floor. Then I took out a piece of paper, plain white, nothing fancy, and wrote 3 sentences. Son, I'm at Wicker Park. Window overlooks maple trees. I'm fine. I started to add more. Started to write about the apartment, about Vernon, about the bridge project I'd been asked to consult on. But I stopped. That was the best truth I could give right now. For the first time, it was enough. I folded the letter along the creases he'd made in prison. His handwriting looked like mine, same angular precision, same engineer's economy of space. We'd built our lives with the same tools, just constructed different things. I addressed the envelope and walked 4 blocks to the post office. Mailed it before I could reconsider. Came home and put his letter in my desk drawer. Didn't throw it away. Didn't frame it. Just kept it. The nonprofit called 2 weeks later. November early afternoon, while I was assembling the table Vernon had insisted I needed. Mr. Ashford, young voice professional but uncertain. My name is Connor Mayfield. I'm a civil engineer with the Riverside Community Alliance. We're working on a pedestrian bridge project over the Chicago River South Branch near Canalport. We heard about you through the Engineering Association. Would you consult on load calculations? We can't pay, but I accept, I said. Pause on the line. You don't want to know more about the project first? No, I said. When do you need me? Connor was 34, earnest in the way young engineers are when they still believe infrastructure can solve social problems. He met me at the construction site the following Monday. Vacant lot between industrial buildings, chain link fence, surveying stakes marking where the bridge would cross 60 feet of river. He showed me the preliminary designs. Pedestrian span, steel frame, concrete deck. Nothing complicated. But the load calculations needed verification, and their budget didn't cover a senior engineering firm. This is good work, I told him, reviewing the drawings. Your stress analysis is solid. I can verify the calculations, maybe suggest some reinforcement adjustments for the winter freeze-thaw cycles. Connor's face lit up like I'd just solved an equation he'd been stuck on for months. That would be incredible. Do you want to name the bridge? Your contribution deserves recognition. We could put a plaque. No, I said. Bridge doesn't need a name, just needs to withstand weight. First bridge in 40 years I was building without a contract, without my name on a plaque, without anyone knowing I'd been there. Just steel and concrete doing what they're designed to do, hold weight. I spent 3 weeks reviewing calculations, visiting the site, consulting with Connor's team. We adjusted the foundation depth to account for soil composition, reinforced the center support to handle asymmetric loading when foot traffic clustered on one side. Small changes that would make the structure last 30 years instead of 15. Nobody but Connor and his team knew I was involved. No press releases, no recognition from the Engineering Association. Just a bridge that would work. Driving home from the final site visit, I stopped at a red light and glanced in the rearview mirror. Hair grayer than last June, wrinkles deeper around my eyes, 60 years old looking it. But something in my eyes looked different. Lighter, maybe? Less like I was carrying load I couldn't distribute. I couldn't name it. Then thought maybe I don't need to. The red light turned to green. I looked one more time in the rearview mirror at those lighter eyes. 60 years old, grayer, more wrinkled, poorer by 40 years of savings. But something had changed. I pressed the accelerator. Behind me, the river bridge construction site disappeared. Ahead, just the road home. For the first time in 9 months, that was enough. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table until the light changed. The maple tree outside looked the same as yesterday. The apartment looked the same. But something had shifted. Some internal load I'd been carrying had redistributed into a configuration I could actually bear. My son's second letter arrived in November with 3 pages about prison kitchen work and a 62-year-old cellmate who taught him to weld. And I realized we'd never actually talked like this when he was free. The first letter in October had been careful. 3 questions, no requests. This one was different. 3 pages, single-spaced, his engineer's printing filling both sides of the paper. Kitchen work, he wrote. Welding apprenticeship with 62-year-old cellmate named Raymond. He says I have steady hands. Funny what you learn about yourself in prison. He described the routine. Morning count at 6. Kitchen shift starting at 7. The industrial dishwasher that broke every 3rd day. The way Raymond measured weld angles by sight because they weren't allowed protractors. Small details. The architecture of a life I'd never imagined my son would live. I wrote back about the community bridge project, the load calculations, the way Connor's team had adjusted the foundation depth based on my recommendations, the satisfaction of building something nobody would know I'd touched. We exchanged letters once or twice a month through the fall, no phone calls. Something about written words made it possible to tell truths we'd never been able to speak aloud. He wrote about prison. I wrote about the maple tree and the bare apartment and Vernon's visits. We didn't discuss the fraud, didn't discuss the families or the trial or the reasons he was in Terre Haute and I was in Wicker Park. Just described our lives like engineers describing separate construction sites. The 4th letter arrived mid-November. 3 pages again. The first 2 pages were routine kitchen work. Raymond teaching him how to repair the industrial mixer. The library where he was allowed to read engineering texts. The 3rd page was different. I've been thinking about the inspection engineer fired in 2003, he wrote. The one whose report was rejected for Harrington Crossing Bridge. I didn't know until recently that he was Paloma's father, Ernest Holbrook. She never told me the details, just that her family had been hurt by the construction industry, by people who stayed silent when they should have spoken. I understand now why she targeted you specifically. Both you and I have hurt people without seeing them. We built things, you built bridges, I built financial structures, and we didn't look at who was underneath when the weight came down. I read that line 3 times. Both you and I have hurt people without seeing them. My son, who'd defrauded 47 families, understood what I'd spent 40 years refusing to admit. He saw it from prison. I'd been free the whole time. I sat at the kitchen counter with that letter for 2 hours. Then I took out paper and wrote the full truth about Harrington Crossing. The stress fractures, Ernest Holbrook's report, the senior partners rejecting it. My silence. The bridge that still stood 22 years later, proving Ernest wrong in the way that destroyed careers and vindicated people who should have been questioned. I wrote 4 pages, sealed the envelope before I could reconsider, mailed it that afternoon. Then I looked up Ernest Holbrook's current address. The nursing home was in the suburbs, single-story facility, surrounded by manicured lawns that looked maintained by people who'd never met the residents. I arrived without calling ahead, told the front desk I was there to see Ernest Holbrook. The receptionist asked if I was family. No, I said, but he'll know who I am. They directed me to the common room. Ernest was in a wheelchair near the window, looking out at a retention pond where geese gathered. He was 79 now, thinner than I remembered, with white hair and hands that trembled slightly when he adjusted his glasses. I sat in the chair next to him, without introduction. He looked at me for 10 seconds, then nodded once. Mr. Ashford? I am the one who remained silent when your report was rejected in 2003, I said. I've come to say that. Long pause. Ernest looked back out at the pond. A goose landed on the water wings, spreading wide to break. I know, he said finally. I've known who you are for a long time. My daughter knows too. I understand, I said. That's why she... But I didn't teach her to use that for revenge? Ernest interrupted. His voice was steady, measured. That was her own decision. I told her years ago to let it go. She chose differently. We sat in silence. The geese on the pond rearranged themselves in patterns that looked purposeful but probably weren't. Harrington Crossing Bridge still stands today, I said quietly. 22 years. I know, Ernest said. I check it every year. That stopped me. You check it. Every year, he confirmed. Drive out in October, stand on the bridge, look at the support columns, measure the stress points I flagged in my report, see if they've finally failed the way I said they would. And they haven't, Ernest said. Bridge is fine. I was wrong about the timeline, maybe wrong about the severity, maybe wrong about everything. He turned to look at me directly. But you were still wrong to stay silent. Yes, I said. Ernest checked that bridge every year for 22 years. Not to see if it would fall, to see if it was still standing despite what I'd done. Annual measurement of consequences that refused to collapse on schedule. Why did you come here? Ernest asked. To tell you I should have spoken in 2003, I said. To acknowledge that my silence cost you your career. And to tell you that you were right about the principle, even if you were wrong about the timeline, I said. Some failures take longer to manifest than others. Ernest nodded slowly. Your son... 9 years, I said. Federal prison. And you, living in Wicker Park, I said. Everything I owned went to victim compensation. Ernest looked back out at the pond. Some structures fail fast. Some fail slow. Some hold weight they shouldn't be able to hold until someone finally looks underneath and sees what it costs to keep them standing. I left the nursing home and drove to Harrington Crossing. Stood on the bridge looking down at the river for 20 minutes. 22 years, and the structure hadn't failed. But Ernest Holbrook's career had. His reputation had. His family had built their revenge on this bridge that wouldn't fall. I built it to last. It did. That was the problem. I stood on that bridge until the sun started setting, and the December cold made my hands ache. Then I drove back to Wicker Park and sat at my kitchen table thinking about structures that hold weight they shouldn't be able to hold, and the people who pay the cost of keeping them standing. Vernon raised his wine glass across the table that December Friday and said the SSEC had cleared him completely, and I realized some endings actually feel like endings instead of ellipses. We'd been meeting at the Greektown restaurant every Friday since November. Same corner table, same moussaka and roasted lamb, same efficient waitress who'd stopped asking if we wanted menus. It had become routine the way good things become routine, not through planning but through showing up. Vernon looked older in the restaurant lighting, 74, carrying the year on his face the way we all were. But something in his posture had straightened. Some weight had lifted. SEC completed the investigation, he said, setting down his water glass to pick up the wine. Reviewed my cooperation, the statute of limitations for the original offense. No prosecution. I felt something release in my chest I hadn't known I was holding. That's good news, Vernon. Should have told you sooner, he said. Got the letter Tuesday. Wanted to tell you in person. I'm glad you did. He raised his glass higher. The wine caught the candlelight cheap table candle in a red glass holder, but it made the wine look better than it probably was. To what? He asked. To remaining friends after 30 years, I said. After all this. 40 years, Vernon corrected. We met in '84. 40 years, I agreed. We tapped glasses. The sound was small and hollow and perfect. We'd tapped champagne flutes at contract signings worth millions. We'd tapped beer bottles at construction sites when foundations passed inspection. This felt more significant than any of those. The SEC had cleared him. 30 years of friendship had survived fraud federal investigations testimony that could have implicated him if circumstances had been different. He'd shown up every month since June, brought lunch, helped me move, never asked if I regretted turning in my own son, just stayed. 20-year-old house wine at a Greektown restaurant we'd been visiting for 40 years. Not expensive, not impressive, just exactly right. That's what friendship looked like after surviving fraud, betrayal, and federal investigations. Still here, still right. How's the bridge project? Vernon asked. Finishing this month, I said. Connor's team is doing the final welds next week. Should be open to foot traffic by January. You going to the opening? No, I said. Don't need to. Bridge will work whether I'm there or not. Vernon nodded, cutting his lamb with the focused precision of someone who'd spent 50 years making careful cuts in careful places. That's different from how you used to do things. Everything's different from how I used to do things, I said. Better. I thought about that. The apartment. The letters from Stellan. The unnamed bridge. Ernest Holbrook checking Harrington Crossing every year for 22 years. Different, I said. Maybe better. Hard to tell yet. Vernon raised his glass again. To different, I agreed. We finished dinner around 8. Vernon caught the 9:15 train back to Springfield. I walked home through December cold that made the city feel cleaner somehow, like the temperature was purifying something in the air. Christmas morning, I sat alone at my kitchen table with toast and coffee. No 8-person dining table, no candles, no Bordeaux, just me and the maple tree outside and the winter light coming through the window at an angle that made the bare apartment look less empty than it was. The mail arrived at 9:30. I heard it hit the floor by the door, that particular sound of envelopes sliding across hardwood. I got up and found 3 pieces grocery store circular electric bill and a white envelope with a federal prison postmark. I brought all 3 back to the table but only looked at one. The return address was printed in the same institutional format, as always, FCI Terre Haute, Indiana. Stellan's name in the upper left, but this time there was something else, a small notation in the corner. Holiday mail expedited. I turned the envelope over. The postmark read December 18th, a week early. He'd sent it a week early to make sure it arrived today. I set the envelope down and looked out the window. The maple tree stood bare against December sky, black branches in precise geometric patterns, no leaves to hide the structure underneath. Honest winter architecture. My son had calculated the timing, had thought about mail delivery schedules and prison processing delays and the days it would take for a letter to travel from Indiana to Illinois. Had done the math to ensure it arrived December 25th. First time in years, he'd planned something around what mattered to me instead of what he needed from me. The envelope's paper felt standard federal prison issue. Thin institutional regulation approved. But my son's handwriting on the address showed careful penmanship, each letter deliberately formed. He'd taken time. That mattered more than the words inside. I poured more coffee. Black, no sugar. I'd stopped buying sugar 3 months ago when I realized I was the only person who came to this apartment and I didn't actually need it. Small economy, one of dozens I'd made since June. They added up to a life that fit in 400 square feet and cost less than I'd spent on wine in a single year at the penthouse. The toast was cold now. I ate it anyway. Christmas morning, 60 years old, alone at a kitchen table in Wicker Park with a letter from my son in federal prison. 3 years ago, I'd been in the penthouse with Elaine's portrait on the mantel and catered dinner for 8, and wine that cost more per bottle than my monthly grocery budget now. That version of Christmas had felt hollow, Even then, performance of celebration rather than actual joy. This felt different, smaller, quieter, more real. I picked up the envelope again, felt the weight of 3 pages inside heavier than the 2-page letters he'd been sending. More to say this time. The maple tree outside caught morning light on its bare branches. No pretense, no decoration, just the honest shape of what it was in winter. I slid my finger under the envelope seal. The maple tree outside stood bare against the December sky. No leaves, no shade, just honest winter branches that held their shape without pretending to be summer. The letter unfolded in my hands. 3 pages this time, not 2. I unfolded the letter carefully. What I'd thought was 3 pages turned out to be 5 smaller handwriting than usual, light blue ink that looked cheaper than the black he'd used before. My son's Christmas letter opened with 5 pages of smaller than usual handwriting in light blue ink, and the first line said, "I calculated today how many hours of prison kitchen work equals $1." I set my coffee down and read, "Kitchen shift starts at 5 a.m. We prep breakfast for 800 inmates. I earn 17 cents an hour. That's 5 hours and 53 minutes per dollar. It took me 3 weeks to earn enough for this paper and the stamps to mail it." He described the work in engineer's detail. The industrial dishwasher that broke every Monday. The way Raymond checked weld temperatures by counting seconds instead of using a thermometer. The 62-year-old cellmate whose son hadn't visited in 4 years, who taught Stellan to repair kitchen equipment and never asked what he'd done to end up in Terre Haute. Raymond told me yesterday that steady hands matter more than smart words. He doesn't know I use smart words to steal from people who trusted me. But he's teaching me that work, real work, has different math. Hours equal dollars. Effort equals result. There's no leverage, no multiplication, no way to make 1 hour of work generate returns from 47 other people's hours. I read that paragraph 3 times. Page 3 was different. The handwriting got smaller. I've lived my whole life thinking Dad's money was mine, that his reputation was capital I could borrow against. Here, earning 17 cents an hour, I understand what each dollar actually represents. How many hours of hard work? How many years of doing things right when no one's watching? My throat tightened. "I'm sorry, Dad. Not because I was arrested. Not because I got caught. I'm sorry because I stole Mom's last year's. I took the money she needed to live and used it to sustain a fraud built on your name. I can't fix that. I can't undo the 47 families, or the lies, or the forgery. I don't dare ask if you forgive me. I just want you to know I'm trying to become the person you and Mom deserve me to be." I set the letter down and looked at Elaine's photograph on the counter, the one from our 30th anniversary. Her smile in that picture had always looked like she knew something I didn't. "Can you hear me?" I said to the photograph. The maple tree outside swayed in December wind, bare branches moving in patterns I couldn't predict but could trust. "I'll take that as an answer," I said. I spent Christmas afternoon writing a reply. 6 pages longest letter I'd ever written to anyone. Started 3 times, threw away 2 drafts, finally just told the truth without trying to engineer the structure first. I wrote about Harrington Crossing, the full story, the stress fractures Ernest Holbrook had flagged, the senior partners overruling his report, my silence that cost him his career. I wrote about 40 years of marriage where I'd used money to speak when I should have used words, used precision when I should have used presence, used silence when I should have used truth. Both were wrong, I wrote. I built structures that would last centuries but didn't build a relationship that could survive one crisis. I'm sorry I taught you to measure value in money and reputation instead of hours and honesty. 6 pages. I'd never written more than 2 paragraphs to anyone in 40 years, but my son was in prison learning to count the hours in a dollar. The least I could do was count the truths I'd left unsaid. The final page was invitation. "When you get out of prison, I want to take you to see the bridge over Chicago River I'm helping build. It'll be finished next fall. No contract, no payment, no name on a plaque, just a bridge that will help people cross water safely. I'll be waiting for you." I signed it Dad, not "I love you." We weren't there yet, but Dad was real, and real was enough to begin with. I walked to the bridge construction site around 4 p.m. routine I'd developed on weekends since October. The site was empty, chain link fence locked, but I could see the incomplete structure spanning 60 feet of water, 65% complete. The steel girders stood without the bridge, deck bare bones of the structure holding December wind. unfinished but already capable of bearing load because the foundation was right. I took out my phone and texted Vernon, "It will stand." His reply came 30 seconds later, "Of course, you built it." The bridge stood incomplete against the Chicago winter sky, bare steel holding December wind without complaint. Unfinished doesn't mean unable. Sometimes the most honest structures are the ones still being built. I thought about June, the FBI interview, Russell Thorne's question about whether I'd known. The decision to tell the truth when lying would have been easier. Every choice since then had been about foundation tearing down what was built on fraud and starting over with honesty as the load-bearing structure. 40 years, I'd built things for others. Now I was rebuilding something for myself, not rushed, not perfect, but with the right foundation. The setting sun caught the steel girders and threw orange light across the river water. 65% complete. Foundation right. Load-bearing capacity, tested and proven. I stood there watching until the sun dropped below the buildings and the bridge turned to silhouette, incomplete, but standing unfinished, but sound. A bridge doesn't need to be finished to hold weight. It just needs the right foundation, honest materials, proper engineering, time to cure. I thought about my son and Terre Haute learning to count hours per dollar, about Vernon and Springfield cleared by the SEC still showing up every Friday, about Ernest Holbrook checking Harrington Crossing every year for 22 years, about 47 families receiving compensation, about Elaine's diary telling me to save my son with truth. All of it, the loss, the exposure, the prison, the liquidation had been necessary to get to this foundation. To stand at a construction site on Christmas afternoon and understand that 65% complete was exactly enough. That is enough. That has always been enough. I just never knew it until I lost everything else. And to you listening to my story, remember this: truth costs everything, but lies cost more. I spent 40 years building things that would last centuries, but I didn't build honesty in my own family. I used money to speak when I should have used words. I used silence when I should have confronted uncomfortable truths. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until everything collapses to finally tell the truth. The foundation you build in your family matters more than any structure you'll ever engineer. Some people ask if this was father revenge or justice. I don't know. What I know is this: protecting someone from consequences isn't love. It's enabling their destruction. Real love tells the truth even when it costs everything. I believe God put me through this to teach me that lesson at 60 when I thought I knew everything. The weight I carried for 40 years, the silence, the compromise, the protection that hurt more than helped, had to burn away before I could stand on solid ground. If my story resonated with you, leave a comment below. Tell me, do you think this was father revenge, or was it love in its hardest form? Some call it father revenge. I call it the only way I could save what was left of my integrity. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Father's Vengeance for more stories like this. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your presence here means more than you know. One final reminder: this story contains fictionalized elements for storytelling and reflection. What matters most is the lesson it carries. May you find the courage to tell the truth when it costs everything.